Chapter 1 Ancestry and Early Youth in Boston. Twyford, at the Bishop of St. Asaph's, 1771. Dear son, it brings me joy to collect stories about our ancestors. You might recall the efforts I made when we were in England, searching for family history among my remaining relatives, and even taking a journey to do so. Now that I'm retired in this countryside with a week of uninterrupted time ahead, I'm sitting down to write about my life experiences for you. Additionally, I have other motives. Having risen from poverty and obscurity, where I was born and raised, to a place of wealth and some renown, and having had a good deal of happiness throughout my life, the strategies that helped me achieve this success with God's blessing are worth sharing. My descendants may find them useful for their own lives and potentially adopt them as worthy of imitation. You might recall the efforts I made when we were in England, searching for family history among my remaining relatives, and even taking a journey to do so. Now that I'm retired in this countryside with a week of uninterrupted time ahead, I'm sitting down to write about my life experiences for you. Having risen from poverty and obscurity, where I was born and raised, to a place of wealth and some renown, and having had a good deal of happiness throughout my life, the strategies that helped me achieve this success with God's blessing are worth sharing. Since a second chance at life isn't feasible, the closest alternative is reflecting on and preserving memories of one's life through writing, thereby making them as long-lasting as possible. I intend to share my personal experiences and past deeds as an old man naturally tends to do, but I'll do so without being tedious to others who might feel obligated to listen due to my age. In their own autobiographical writings, renowned 18th-century British historians Edward Gibbon and David Hume, who lived during the same era as Benjamin Franklin, mirrored a similar sentiment regarding the appropriateness of modestly acknowledging one's own achievements through self-praise. One of my uncles shared his family history notes with me, which revealed that our ancestors had lived in the same village, Ecton, Northamptonshire, for 300 years or possibly longer. They were a family of freeholders who owned about 30 acres and ran a smithy business where the eldest son was always trained to follow the trade. My great-grandfather Thomas lived in Ecton until old age, then moved to Banbury, Oxfordshire, where he died and is buried. My great-grandfather had 4 sons, Thomas, John, Benjamin, and Josiah. The eldest son, Thomas, inherited a house at Ecton but left it to his only child, a daughter, who sold the property to Mr. Isted, current lord of the manor. My uncle's notes likely contain more details about these family members, which I may be able to access upon my return. Thomas was raised in a blacksmithing family but pursued a different path due to his innate intelligence and encouragement from Esquire Palmer. The writer recalls hearing about Thomas's life from elderly locals at Ecton, noting a striking resemblance to their own experiences. Benjamin Franklin's brother John was a wool dyer and later lived with their father in Boston. The nephew was named after John due to their close family bond. The discovery suggests John left the collection behind when he traveled to America about 50 years prior. Our family was an early adopter of Protestantism and maintained this stance throughout Queen Mary's reign, often facing potential trouble for opposing Catholicism. This story was shared with me by my Uncle Benjamin. Meanwhile, other family members continued adhering to the Church of England. My father, Josiah, married young and had a family with 3 children before moving to New England around 1682. The restrictions on conventicles led him and other like-minded individuals to settle in this new land, seeking freedom for their religious practices. I was the youngest son and one of the last 2 born, growing up in Boston, New England. My mother, Abia, was the daughter of Peter Folger, an early settler and respected Englishman who wrote occasional pieces, though only one was published. In contrast, my father sent me to a grammar school at 8 years old, intending that I would become a scholar in service of the Church, following his plans for each eldest son. My early ability to read and the expectation that I'd excel academically motivated him. Even my Uncle Benjamin supported this path, offering me his collection of shorthand sermons if I learned his notation. However, my father eventually changed his mind due to concerns about the cost of a college education for our large family. He decided not to pursue the original plan and instead enrolled me in a school focused on writing and arithmetic run by Mr. George Brownell. At age 10, my father brought me home to assist him in his tallow chandler and soap boiler business, which he had started after arriving in America due to the decline of his original dyeing trade. I wasn't thrilled about the trade my father had in mind for me, but I had a natural affinity for the ocean and spent a lot of time near it. We were caught and reprimanded by our parents. Although I defended the project's usefulness, my father taught me that nothing is truly useful unless it's honest. Although he never served in a public capacity due to his family's needs and financial constraints, people respected his opinions on local affairs and sought him out for advice. At home, he preferred having intelligent friends over for conversation and would initiate discussions on innovative or useful topics, aiming to educate his children on what constitutes a good life. I never knew my parents to suffer any serious illness besides the one that took their lives, my father at age 89 and my mother at 85. Without wealth or a steady income, they thrived through relentless work and industry, blessed by Providence, supporting our large family comfortably and raising 13 children and 7 grandchildren with dignity. My father was a devout and wise man, my mother a prudent and virtuous woman. As their youngest son, in reverence for their memory, I placed this stone. I remained involved in my father's business for 2 years until the age of 12, when my older brother left to start his own tallow chandler shop in Rhode Island. My father feared that if he didn't find an alternative trade that suited me, I would follow my Uncle Josiah and pursue a career at sea instead. To gauge my interest, my father took me on walks to observe various skilled craftsmen such as joiners, bricklayers, turners, and braziers. When my father decided that cutlery might be a suitable trade, he sent me to Boston to apprentice with his nephew Samuel, who had a shop there. I remained involved in my father's business for 2 years until the age of 12, when my older brother left to start his own tallow chandler shop in Rhode Island. My father feared that if he didn't find an alternative trade that suited me, I would follow my Uncle Josiah and pursue a career at sea instead. To gauge my interest, my father took me on walks to observe various skilled craftsmen such as joiners, bricklayers, turners, and braziers. This experience has remained a source of joy for me, as it allowed me to appreciate good workmanship and develop the ability to perform small tasks myself when help was unavailable. When my father decided that cutlery might be a suitable trade, he sent me to Boston to apprentice with his nephew Samuel, who had a shop there. However, disagreements over payment plans led to my return home. Chapter 2, Beginning Life as a Printer. From a young age, I developed a passion for reading and invested all my available money in books. My initial collection featured John Bunyan's works in smaller volumes, which I later sold to purchase Robert Burton's historical collections, a set of around 40-50 affordable books. My father's modest library mostly contained theological texts that I read thoroughly, though I now wish more suitable titles had been at my disposal during that period when I was eager to learn and had decided not to pursue the clergy. Plutarch's Lives made a significant impact on me, as I spent a great deal of time reading it and still consider those hours well spent. Additionally, an essay on projects by Daniel Defoe and Essays to Do Goodbye Richard Mather possibly influenced my thought process, which in turn played a role in shaping the major events of my life that followed. From a young age, I developed a passion for reading and invested all my available money in books. My initial collection featured John Bunyan's works in smaller volumes, which I later sold to purchase Robert Burton's historical collections, a set of around 40-50 affordable books. My father's modest library mostly contained theological texts that I read thoroughly, though I now wish more suitable titles had been at my disposal during that period when I was eager to learn and had decided not to pursue the clergy. Plutarch's Lives made a significant impact on me, as I spent a great deal of time reading it and still consider those hours well spent. As a book-loving child, I was destined to follow in the footsteps of my father's profession, printing. However, my brother James had already established his own print business in Boston after returning from England in 1717. While I preferred working with my brother over our father, the sea still called to me. Quickly, I excelled at printing and became a valuable asset to my brother's business. Through this, I gained access to more books and formed friendships with bookshop apprentices, occasionally borrowing small volumes to devour into the night, always ensuring their timely return in pristine condition. A clever merchant named Matthew Adams, who owned an impressive book collection and frequently visited our printing house, noticed me and kindly lent me books to read. As time passed, I developed a taste for poetry and started writing my own pieces. My brother encouraged me, suggesting I compose occasional ballads. These early efforts were poorly written in the style of Grub Street ballads, and when published, my brother had me sell them on the streets. The first piece sold exceptionally well due to its timely subject matter, which boosted my ego. I knew a fellow in town named John Collins who shared my love for books. I had developed this trait by reading my father's books on religious debates. Although Collins was more eloquent and verbose, I wrote out my arguments to send to him, and our exchange of letters continued several times before my father found them. Instead of addressing the debate's topic, he focused on my writing style, pointing out that although I had an edge in spelling and grammar due to my experience with printing, my expressions lacked elegance, my structure was unclear, and my arguments weren't convincing. I reasoned that if I had continued writing poetry, I would have developed these skills over time, as crafting verses requires constant search for varied words and phrasing to accommodate rhyme and meter. Upon comparing my work with the original, I discovered numerous errors and corrected them, sometimes even thinking I had improved on certain aspects, which boosted my confidence that I might one day become an acceptable English writer, a goal I was intensely ambitious about. My available time for these exercises and reading occurred at night after work or before it started in the morning, or on Sundays when I could sneak away to the printing house alone, avoiding as much as possible the family's expectation of attending public worship. As my brother, who was not married, boarded elsewhere with his apprentices, my decision caused inconveniences and teasing from others for being different. I learned about Tryon's meal preparation methods, such as boiling potatoes or making hasty pudding, and proposed that if my brother paid me half of what he spent on my board, I would fend for myself. At a point when my lack of mathematical skills embarrassed me, having previously struggled to learn arithmetic twice during my schooling, I picked up Cocker's arithmetic book and worked through it independently with ease. Additionally, I read Sellers and Shermis's navigation books, familiarizing myself with the basic geometry they covered, but didn't delve deeply into that subject. It was also around this time that I read Locke's On Human Understanding and The Art of Thinking by the Messrs. As I sought to improve my language skills, I discovered an English grammar book, Greenwood's, I think, that included brief lessons on rhetoric and logic, culminating in a Socratic-style dispute example. As I delved into the works of Shaftesbury and Collins, my doubts about religious doctrine grew, and I found that the Socratic method allowed me to express these doubts effectively, often leading to concessions from others. My brother started a newspaper around 1720 or 1721, making it the second one in America, following the Boston Newsletter. By the time I'm writing this, 1771, there are at least 25 newspapers now in circulation. Despite initial doubts, my brother persevered and eventually published the New England Courant. Among his friends, he had clever individuals who contributed humorous pieces to this publication, boosting its popularity and reputation. Hearing these conversations sparked my interest in writing for the paper as well. But since I was still a young boy, I worried that my brother, the paper's owner, would object to publishing my work if he knew it was mine. The next morning the paper was discovered and shared with his writing friends when they arrived for their usual meeting. I became more confident after writing several well-received papers and kept my newfound success a secret until I felt like I'd exhausted my initial reservoir of ideas. At this point my brother started to take notice, but not without some discomfort on his part. He thought my growing reputation made me too full of myself. This might have contributed to the disagreements we began having around that time. as he treated me like an apprentice and expected the same level of service from me as he would from another worker, while I felt he was demanding more than a sibling should. While my brother was imprisoned, I took on the responsibility of managing our newspaper despite our personal disagreements. During this time, I didn't hesitate to criticize those in power through my writings, which pleased my brother but earned me a negative reputation among some as someone who enjoys writing satirical and critical pieces. After my brother's release, an unusual order was issued by the House, stating that James Franklin could no longer publish the New England Courant. To avoid potential Assembly criticism for him still publishing it through his apprentice, a plan was devised where my old indenture would be returned with a full discharge, which I'd produce as needed. Meanwhile, new private indentures were signed by me, ensuring my brother benefited from the remainder of my service term. After some time, a new disagreement arose between my brother and me. When he discovered I planned to leave him, he went around town persuading every printing shop owner not to hire me. So I decided to head to New York, where there was a printer, as it would be easier to get work there than stay in Boston and risk getting into trouble myself for being seen as an infidel because of my religious debates. However, since my father now sided with my brother, I knew he'd try to stop me if I left openly. My friend Collins helped by secretly booking passage on a New York-bound sloop under the guise that I was a young acquaintance of the captain. Chapter 3. Arrival in Philadelphia. By this point, I had lost interest in pursuing a career at sea, but instead decided to focus on my skills as a workman. As a printer myself, I offered my services to Mr. William Bradford, the first printer in Pennsylvania, who had since moved due to disagreements with George Keith. Although he couldn't use my skills, given his minimal workload and existing staff, he recommended that I travel to Philadelphia, where his son was seeking a replacement for the recently deceased Aquila Rose. The distance to Philadelphia was about 100 miles, but I set off in a boat towards Amboy, planning to have my belongings follow me by sea. Although he couldn't use my skills, given his minimal workload and existing staff, he recommended that I travel to Philadelphia, where his son was seeking a replacement for the recently deceased Aquila Rose. The distance to Philadelphia was about 100 miles, but I set off in a boat towards Amboy, planning to have my belongings follow me by sea. His near-drowning experience sobered him slightly, and he drifted off to sleep after first asking me to dry his book, a Dutch edition of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, beautifully printed with copper engraving. As night fell, the boatman, I, and a wet Dutch companion huddled in the cabin, trying to catch some sleep as the sea spray dripped into our space, making us equally wet. We endured a restless night, and the next day, when the wind died down, we managed to reach Amboy just before sunset after 30 hours at sea with no food or fresh water, only salt water and a bottle of rum. As night fell, I discovered myself had a high fever and went to bed. Despite knowing no better, I decided to follow advice suggesting drinking cold water could help alleviate a fever. The next morning, after crossing the ferry, I continued my journey on foot, a total of 50 miles to Burlington, where I was informed I would find boats that would transport me the rest of the way to Philadelphia. I decided to stop at a humble inn for the night, starting to regret my decision to leave home. Despite this, I continued on the next day and arrived at an inn near Burlington in the evening, run by Dr. Brown. I spent the night at a house in Burlington, but was dismayed to find that regular boats had left just before my arrival and wouldn't return until Tuesday. I sought advice from an elderly woman who sold me gingerbread, and she kindly offered for me to stay with her until a boat became available again. As a printer, she urged me to set up shop in Burlington, not realizing the initial investment required. Despite being initially convinced to stay, I ventured out one evening by the river and caught a passing boat heading to Philadelphia. Upon awakening, we recognized our location as being just above Philadelphia and arrived at Market Street Wharf around 8 or 9 a.m. on Sunday. I arrived dressed for work as my nicer clothes were coming by sea. I was dusty from traveling, carrying a bundle of shirts and stockings in my pockets, and didn't know a single person or where to find a place to stay. I continued on, observing the surroundings as I walked up the street until near the market house, where I met a boy selling bread. Having had many meals consisting of bread, I asked him where he got it, and followed his recommendation to a bakery in 2nd Street. I proceeded up Market Street to 4th Street, passing my future wife's father's home, where she was standing at the door, and likely found my disheveled appearance quite amusing. As satisfied from eating one of the rolls, I gave the remaining 2 to a woman and her child who had arrived on the same boat as us and were waiting to continue their journey further. My exhaustion from labor and lack of rest the previous night eventually got the better of me, and I fell into a deep sleep, only waking when the meeting concluded and someone kindly roused me. After dinner my drowsiness returned, and after being led to a bed, I fell asleep without changing into night-clothes, only waking up at 6 in the evening for supper, then going back to sleep early on and staying that way until morning. The next day I got dressed as neatly as possible and went to Andrew Bradford's printing shop. There I encountered his father, an old man I had previously met in New York, who arrived in Philadelphia before me while traveling by horseback. However, he suggested that another local printer, Keimer, might be looking for someone like me, and if not, I would still be welcome to stay at his house and occasionally do some work until more substantial opportunities arose. Upon our arrival, he introduced me as a young individual with a similar profession, possibly fitting for their needs according to Bradford's account. The gentleman asked me some questions, demonstrated my skills by having me use a composing stick, and then expressed his intention to hire me soon, although he had no immediate work available at the time. He then engaged in conversation with Bradford about his current projects and future plans, while underestimating that Bradford was Keimer's father. Unaware of their familial connection, Bradford cleverly asked questions and raised doubts to extract more information from Keimer about his business strategies, interests, and goals. I discovered that Keimer's printing house was modest, with an old press and one worn-out English font. At the time, Keimer himself was composing an elegy for Aquilla Rose, a well-respected young man in town known for his literary skill. I tried to organize Keimer's press, which he had not yet used and didn't understand, with the promise of printing off his elegy once it was complete. I left to work at Bradford's for a while before returning to help Keimer print the elegy when it was ready. However, upon my return, Keimer had acquired another set of type cases and needed me to reprint a pamphlet instead. Bradford was untrained and illiterate, while Keimer, despite being somewhat educated, only knew how to typeset, not operate a press. Initially, he wasn't pleased with me staying at Bradford's while working with him. With my belongings now arrived, I presented myself more respectably to Miss Reed than when she first saw me eating on the street. I started to form friendships with young readers from the town, spending pleasant evenings discussing books. As I earned money through hard work and thrift, I lived comfortably and tried to put Boston behind me. Only my confidant Collins knew my new location and kept it a secret when I corresponded with him. However, an unexpected event prompted my return sooner than planned. My brother-in-law, Robert Holmes, who commanded a sloop that sailed between Boston and Delaware, was in Newcastle, near Philadelphia. He learned of my whereabouts and wrote to me, expressing the concern of my friends in Boston at my sudden departure and urging me to return, assuring me that all would be settled to my satisfaction if I did so. In response, I thanked him for his advice, but explained my reasons for leaving Boston fully, aiming to convince him that my decision was not as misguided as he initially thought. Chapter 4. First Visit to Boston. Governor William Keith was in Newcastle when Captain Holmes showed him a letter from me discussing my potential and age. The governor was surprised by my youth, but saw promise in me, suggesting I would succeed if I established a printing business in Philadelphia. He offered to help with securing government contracts and assisting me in any way he could. My brother-in-law later informed me of this conversation in Boston. At the time, I was unaware of it. One day, while working alongside Keimer near the window, we noticed Governor Keith and Colonel French arriving at our doorstep. Governor William Keith was in Newcastle when Captain Holmes showed him a letter from me discussing my potential and age. The governor was surprised by my youth, but saw promise in me, suggesting I would succeed if I established a printing business in Philadelphia. My brother-in-law later informed me of this conversation in Boston. At the time, I was unaware of it. One day, while working alongside Keimer near the window, we noticed Governor Keith and Colonel French arriving at our doorstep. Keimer initially thought Governor Sharpie was visiting him, but it turned out that the governor was actually looking for me. The governor showed an unexpected level of courtesy, complimented me, expressed a desire to get to know me better, and mildly scolded me for not introducing myself when I first arrived. At the tavern, Governor Sharp brought up my business idea, discussed the potential for success, and assured me that he and Colonel French would use their influence to secure government contracts for me once I started the venture. He even offered to write a letter to my father, explaining the benefits and promising to persuade him to support my decision. It was decided that I would return to Boston on the next available ship with the governor's letter of recommendation. In late April 1724, a small ship set sail for Boston, where I was headed to visit friends. Just before departing, the governor of Pennsylvania gave me an endorsement letter full of praise about my abilities and encouraged my plans to establish myself in Philadelphia, saying it would surely bring me prosperity. Unfortunately, our journey wasn't smooth sailing. We hit a shoal, took on water, and faced strong winds that required us to pump constantly for nearly 2 weeks before reaching Boston safely. It had been 7 months since I left, and my friends were surprised by my sudden return, unaware of my whereabouts due to my brother's absence. One of them asked what kind of money we used, so I showed them a handful of silver coins, an unusual sight since Boston primarily used paper currency. My mother later attempted to reconcile us, hoping we could move forward as brothers, but my brother believed that my display of silver coins and watch in front of his friends had been an insult he couldn't forgive, a misconception that was corrected over time. My father received the governor's letter about my potential business venture with apparent surprise, but didn't mention it to me right away. When Captain Holmes returned, he showed him the letter and asked about Keith, inquiring about his character. The captain defended my proposal, but my father firmly believed I was too young for such a venture. He eventually wrote a polite response to Sir William, thanking him for considering me but declining assistance due to his opinion that I wasn't mature enough to manage a significant business, requiring substantial preparation and investment. My close friend Collins, a postal clerk, was inspired by my stories about the new country I discovered. But before I could even ask my father's permission, Collins set off overland to Rhode Island, leaving behind his impressive collection of mathematical and philosophical books, which were scheduled to arrive in New York with me, where he planned to await our arrival. My father didn't initially agree with Sir William's proposal, but he was pleased that I managed to secure a favorable reputation from someone notable during my stay, and that I had worked diligently to prepare myself so quickly. Since there was no chance of reconciliation with my brother, he gave his consent for me to return to Philadelphia. This was all the support I received, aside from small gifts symbolizing our love when I set off again for New York, now with their approval and blessing. A friend of his named Vernon asked if I could collect a sum of money he was owed in Pennsylvania, around £35 in currency, and hold on to it until he gave further instructions on how to transfer the funds. At Newport, I boarded a ship with several passengers headed for New York, including 2 young women traveling together and an elderly Quaker woman with her attendants. As I grew familiar with the young women, the Quaker woman approached me privately, expressing concern for my well-being due to my lack of connections and apparent naivety about the world's dangers. When we arrived in New York, the women invited me to visit them, but I declined and was fortunate to do so. Upon arriving in New York, I reunited with my childhood friend Collins, whom I had known since our youth and shared a love for reading together. Unfortunately, since my departure, Collins had developed a habit of heavy drinking, becoming intoxicated daily upon arriving in New York. His behavior became erratic, and he had even gambled away his funds, forcing me to cover the costs of his lodging and expenses as we traveled to Philadelphia, an inconvenience that added stress to my own journey. The son of Bishop Burnet, then governor of New York, expressed interest in seeing me after learning that one of his passengers had a large collection of books with him on board. I visited the governor with Collins, but he wasn't able to join due to intoxication. As we traveled to Philadelphia, I received money from Vernon, which was crucial for completing our journey. Given that I had Vernon's money, Collins repeatedly borrowed from me, promising to repay once he secured a job. One instance stands out. We were on a boat trip on the Delaware River with some friends when he refused to take his turn rowing. Initially, I kept my plan to establish a business in Philadelphia a secret and continued to do so even after Sir William's offer. If people had known I relied on the governor, they might have advised me not to trust him due to his reputation for making promises he never intended to keep. At that time, I genuinely believed Sir William to be one of the best people in the world. Then he instructed me to prepare for a trip on the annual ship Annis, which was the primary vessel traveling between London and Philadelphia at that time. However, it would take several months before the Annis sailed, so I continued working with Keimer while worrying about the money Collins had taken from me and fearing an impending call from Vernon, though this didn't happen for a few years. During my first journey from Boston, we were stranded off Block Island and caught many cod. I had been a vegetarian until then, sticking firmly to my resolution not to eat animal products. When the opportunity arose to taste some freshly cooked fish, it smelled delightful, triggering an inner struggle between my principles and desires. Initially, I was hesitant due to the notion of unprovoked murder, as the fish couldn't harm us. However, recalling that these fish consumed smaller fish themselves, I rationalized that if they ate each other, why couldn't we? This revelation led me to indulge in cod heartily, occasionally returning to a vegetarian diet. The convenience of being a reasonable creature lies in its ability to find or create justifications for one's actions and choices. Chapter 5: Early Friends in Philadelphia. Keimer and I enjoyed a friendly relationship despite him not knowing about my plans. He retained his passion for debate and argumentation, leading to frequent discussions between us. Using the Socratic method, I'd skillfully guide our conversations, asking seemingly unrelated questions that eventually led to revealing his underlying assumptions, leaving him cautious of being caught off guard. This impressed Keimer so much that he even proposed we collaborate on establishing a new sect, with me handling opponent refutations and him preaching the doctrine. However, as we discussed the doctrines, I discovered several issues which I suggested could be resolved if I was allowed to incorporate some of my own ideas. Keimer and I enjoyed a friendly relationship despite him not knowing about my plans. During this period, my closest friends were Charles Osborne, Joseph Watson, and James Rolfe, all of whom shared a passion for reading. Osborne and Watson worked as clerks for a prominent legal professional and a merchant, respectively. Rolfe was also a clerk, but to a merchant. Watson stood out for his strong moral character, while the others held more flexible religious views, particularly Rolfe, who had been influenced by my ideas and later became disgruntled with me over it. Osborne was known for his honest and open nature, as well as his affectionate relationships with friends. However, he tended to be overly critical when discussing literature. Rolfe was a skilled conversationalist, charming in his mannerisms, and excelled at eloquent speaking. Rolfe was considering dedicating himself to studying poetry, convinced he could excel and even make a living from it, reasoning that famous poets initially made just as many mistakes as he did. However, Osborne tried to dissuade him, asserting Rolfe lacked the talent for poetry and advising him to focus solely on his original trade. He suggested Rolfe could still succeed in the mercantile world through hard work and reliability, eventually earning enough to establish his own business. As the meeting approached, Rolfe shared his finished work with me, but I had procrastinated and didn't have anything prepared. Rolfe then expressed his frustration that our fellow group member Osborne always finds fault in his work, attributing it to envy. Since Osborne is less critical of my work, Rolfe proposed that I adopt his piece as my own, pretending he didn't have time to write one himself, and see how Osborne reacts. We agreed on the plan, and I transcribed Rolfe's work so it would appear in my handwriting. Then came Osborne's performance, which was significantly better. It did justice to the original work, pointing out some shortcomings, yet overall praising its merits. Meanwhile, I was initially hesitant, trying to excuse myself due to inadequate time for corrections, but that wasn't an option, and so my piece was read aloud too. Rolfe offered critiques and suggested improvements, but I defended my text. When Osborne sided with me against Rolfe's criticism, saying the latter was no better a critic than poet, Rolfe dropped the discussion. As they left together, Osborne expressed even greater admiration for my work, admitting he'd held back earlier so as not to seem flattering. When we next met, Ralph discovered our earlier joke at his expense, and Osborne was gently teased about it. Ralph's involvement in this transaction solidified his decision to pursue poetry. Although Ralph did not excel as a poet, he developed into a capable prose writer. I will elaborate on Ralph later. The poet notes that James Ralph, a name added in later editions, was unknown until he wrote an inflammatory work called Sonnet, which viciously attacked Dr. Swift, Mr. Gay, and the poet himself. "Hold your noise, wolves!" While Ralph is howling to Cynthia and owls respond in kind. The poet notes that James Ralph, a name added in later editions, was unknown until he wrote an inflammatory work called Sonnet, which viciously attacked Dr. Swift, Mr. Gay, and the poet himself. Chapter 6. First visit to London. The governor consistently enjoyed my company and frequently invited me to his home, with setting me up for a fixed endeavor being a constant topic of discussion. I was tasked with carrying recommendatory letters to numerous acquaintances and a letter of credit to secure funds for purchasing press equipment, paper, etc. These letters were repeatedly promised for specific times, but a later time was almost cited. The governor kept doing this until the ship's departure was imminent, despite it being postponed multiple times. When I came to bid farewell and receive these letters, his secretary, Dr. Bard, informed me that the governor was too busy writing, but would meet me at Newcastle before the ship set sail, where he would personally hand over the letters. The governor consistently enjoyed my company and frequently invited me to his home, with setting me up for a fixed endeavor being a constant topic of discussion. These letters were repeatedly promised for specific times, but a later time was almost cited. The governor kept doing this until the ship's departure was imminent, despite it being postponed multiple times. When I came to bid farewell and receive these letters, his secretary, Dr. Bard, informed me that the governor was too busy writing, but would meet me at Newcastle before the ship set sail, where he would personally hand over the letters. Ralph, despite having a family, decided to join me on this journey. Initially, people believed he aimed to establish trade connections and sell goods on commission. However, it was later revealed that Ralph had grown discontent with his wife's relatives and intended to abandon her, never to return. After saying goodbye to my friends and making some promises to Miss Reed, I departed Philadelphia by ship, which eventually docked at Newcastle. Upon visiting the governor's quarters, I was informed through his secretary that he couldn't receive me due to pressing matters, but would send any letters aboard, wishing me a safe and swift voyage, etc. Andrew Hamilton, a well-known Philadelphia lawyer, had booked passage on the ship for himself and his son James, later governor. Later, Hamilton and his son returned to Philadelphia due to a lucrative case involving a seized ship, and just before departure, Colonel French boarded the vessel, showing me great respect. This change in status led the other gentlemen to invite Ralph and me to join them in the main cabin, since some space had opened up. I requested the captain to hand over the letters intended for my care, knowing they were on board with Colonel French's dispatches. When I visited the stationer whose address was on one of the letters, he initially denied knowing anyone by Governor Keith's name, but opened the letter and revealed it was actually from Riddlesden, a person he deemed untrustworthy. After recounting the events to my friend Denham, he informed me that Governor Keith had a reputation for being unreliable, and it was unlikely he would have written letters of credit for anyone. Denham suggested I focus on improving my trade skills among London's printers, which could benefit me when I returned to America and establish myself more successfully. Despite this tendency, the man had other impressive qualities. He was inventive, sensible, a capable writer, and a good leader for the people at large, even if not always for the proprietaries, whose directives he occasionally ignored. Ralph and I lived together in Little Britain, London, sharing lodgings at a reasonable cost. He decided he wouldn't return to Philadelphia, and had run out of money due to paying for his passage. Initially, Ralph tried to become an actor, but Wilkes advised against it, saying success was unlikely. I quickly settled into my job at Palmer's, a renowned printing house in Bartholomew Close, and remained there for nearly a year. Despite being diligent, I spent most of my earnings with Ralph on theater outings and other entertainment, depleting our funds until we barely had enough to get by. He seemed to have forgotten his family responsibilities, while I gradually let go of my commitments to Miss Reed, only writing her once to inform her of my delayed return. The essay, titled Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain, was dedicated to my friend Ralph. Only a limited number were printed. During my stay in Little Britain, I became acquainted with Wilcox, a second-hand bookshop owner who lived next door. At the time, circulating libraries didn't exist, but we negotiated an arrangement where, on some terms that have slipped my mind, I could borrow and return any of his books. A pamphlet I wrote somehow ended up in the hands of a surgeon named Lyons, author of The Infallibility of Human Judgment. This led to us getting acquainted, as he frequently visited me to discuss our shared interests. Lyons also brought me to Batson's Coffee House, where he introduced me to Dr. Pemberton, who promised to arrange for me to meet Sir Isaac Newton in the future, which I greatly looked forward to, although it ultimately didn't materialize. Sir Hans Sloane learned of this curiosity and visited me, extending an invitation to my home to view his own collection in Bloomsbury Square. They cohabited for some time until Ralph, still jobless, realized his income couldn't sustain them, including their child. He decided to leave London, seeking a country school position due to his writing skills, arithmetic expertise, and accounting knowledge. He requested I write to him at the new Meister Franklin School in a Berkshire village, where he taught reading and writing to a dozen boys for 6 pence per week. Around that time, Young Satire was published, and I shared it with him, emphasizing the futility of seeking success through poetry. Upon his return to London, he indicated that, in his eyes, I had nullified any prior obligations he owed me, including repaying loans and advances I provided. As I began seeking financial stability, I left Palmer's and joined the larger printing house at Watts, near Lincoln's Inn Fields, where I remained for the rest of my time in London. On my first day at the printing house, I surprised everyone by taking on press work, thinking it would provide the physical exercise I missed from my American days, where compositors and pressmen combined tasks. When needed, I'd carry large type forms up and down stairs with both hands, a feat that left others astonished at my strength, dubbing me the Water American. Our in-house alehouse boy catered to their needs, while my press companion drank 5 pints daily, 1 before breakfast, 2 more with meals, and the last around 6 p.m. My companion continued drinking, spending 4 or 5 shillings every Saturday night on beer, while I was spared this expense and remained financially free. Despite this, I was forced to stand out for several weeks before reluctantly paying the fee due to petty disruptions, such as messed up type, misplaced pages, and broken text, that occurred whenever I left the room. Despite the master's protection, I eventually gave in, realizing it was foolish to be at odds with people I worked with daily. I proposed some reasonable changes to their chapel's rules and successfully implemented them despite opposition. Those who continued to indulge in daily beer consumption often found themselves unable to pay at the alehouse, requiring me to intervene and negotiate on their behalf to secure a pint. They would say their light was out, meaning they were broke. I diligently collected what I had committed to paying for them each Saturday night, occasionally settling accounts of nearly 30 shillings per week. My new landlady was a widow who ran an Italian goods warehouse from her home, which she shared with her daughter, maid, and a warehouse employee who lived elsewhere. Due to her gout and mobility issues, my landlady often stayed in her room, so our evenings together were always filled with lively conversation, even if our simple supper consisted only of anchovy on toast and a shared pint of ale. So she offered to reduce my rent by 2 shillings for the duration of my stay in London, keeping my rate at 1 shilling and 6 pence until I departed. My landlady told me that the woman was a devout Roman Catholic who had initially planned to become a nun but returned to England after failing to thrive abroad. Without a convent in England, she vowed to live like a nun despite the circumstances. She had lived in this attic for years, allowed to stay rent-free by successive Catholic tenants who believed it was a blessing to have her there. On our return journey, at the request of the group whose curiosity Wygate had piqued, I stripped and dove into the river, swimming from near Chelsea all the way to Blackfriars while performing various impressive feats, both above and beneath the water, that amazed and delighted my audience with their novelty. Initially, I was tempted by the idea. However, sharing it with my friend Mr. Denham, who was soon to return to Pennsylvania, He discouraged me from embarking on this trip and instead encouraged me to focus on returning home. One admirable aspect of this gentleman's character is worth noting. Despite previously facing financial struggles in Bristol, which led to him going into debt and eventually seeking new opportunities in America, he successfully built a sizable fortune through his diligence as a merchant. He offered me a job as his clerk where I would manage the books, copy letters, and assist at the store once he teaches me about mercantile business. Once I'm proficient, he intends to send me on a voyage to the West Indies with a cargo of goods, securing profitable commissions for me. If I perform well, he promised to establish me financially. This opportunity appealed to me because I was tired of London, had fond memories of my time in Pennsylvania, and wanted to return there. I put away my printing work, assuming it was a permanent farewell, and devoted myself to a new occupation, accompanying Mr. Denham as we procured goods from various merchants, inspected the packing, ran errands, and visited craftsmen to expedite their tasks. If I'd received this proposal earlier, it might have kept me from returning to America so soon. Interestingly, many years later, you and I would have a significant connection with one of Sir William Wyndham's sons, who became the Earl of Egremont, an event I'll discuss in due time. For almost a year and a half I lived in London, dedicating most of my time to my work and being frugal, only occasionally treating myself by watching plays or reading books. A significant financial burden weighed on me due to a debt from my friend Ralph, who owed me around £27, a substantial amount considering my modest income. While my financial situation didn't improve during that time, I did form connections with clever individuals whose conversations greatly benefited me, and I made significant progress in my reading. For almost a year and a half I lived in London, dedicating most of my time to my work and being frugal, only occasionally treating myself by watching plays or reading books. A significant financial burden weighed on me due to a debt from my friend Ralph, who owed me around £27, a substantial amount considering my modest income. Despite this, I still held affection for him because of his many endearing qualities. While my financial situation didn't improve during that time, I did form connections with clever individuals whose conversations greatly benefited me, and I made significant progress in my reading. Chapter 7, Beginning Business in Philadelphia. On July 23, 1726, we set sail from Gravesend. For a detailed account of our journey, please consult my journal, where all events are thoroughly recorded. One notable aspect of the journal is the personal plan I developed during the voyage, outlining my intentions for living in the future. It's particularly noteworthy that this plan was conceived at such a young age and remained largely followed throughout my life until old age. However, she was never content with Rogers and eventually parted ways due to his debt, another wife, and general worthlessness, despite being a skilled craftsman. In contrast, Keimer had improved his situation, owning a better house, well-stocked stationery shop, numerous new typefaces, and several employees, though none were exceptionally skilled. I devoted myself to the business, learned about accounting, and quickly became skilled at sales. My brother-in-law Holmes is currently in Philadelphia, suggesting I return to my usual work. Meanwhile, Keimer offered me a good salary if I managed his printing business so he could focus on his stationery shop. However, after hearing negative comments about Keimer from his wife's friends in London and being unsuccessful in finding another job as a merchant's clerk, I agreed to work with Keimer again. At Keimer's house, I found the following employees: Hugh Meredith, a 30-year-old Welshman who worked outdoors but was honest, observant, and had some reading skills; Stephen Potts, a young man from the countryside with exceptional natural intelligence and humor, though somewhat idle; John, an untrained Irishman whose service Keimer purchased for 4 years; George Webb, an Oxford graduate whom Keimer bought to work as a compositor; and David Harry, an apprentice. Despite this understanding, I continued with enthusiasm, organizing his printing business and gradually improving the skills of his staff so that they could eventually work independently and efficiently. John, the Irishman, left soon after. I settled in well with the others because they all had more respect for me as they discovered Keimer couldn't teach them much, and they learned something new from me every day. We never worked on Saturdays since that was Keimer's Sabbath, giving me 2 days to read and expand my acquaintance with clever townspeople. Although Keimer treated me kindly and seemed to genuinely care about me, the only thing worrying me was my unpaid debt to Vernon, which I struggled to manage due to my financial inefficiency. Our printing press frequently lacked certain letter types, and there wasn't a reliable foundry for them in America at the time. Although I proved useful initially, my value decreased as the other workers at the printing press improved in their skills. When my wages were paid for the second quarter, Keimer suggested a reduction due to his own financial struggles, which led to him becoming increasingly demanding and short-tempered. However, a small incident eventually broke our working relationship. When a commotion occurred near the courthouse, I leaned out of my window to see what was happening, prompting Keimer to shout at me from the street below, reprimanding me in front of our neighbors for not focusing on my work. That evening, Meredith came to discuss my situation with me. He tried to dissuade me from returning to my homeland, pointing out that Keimer's financial troubles were growing as his debts mounted. He warned that Keimer's poor business practices would eventually lead to bankruptcy, creating an opportunity for us to take over the venture instead. I expressed concerns about lacking funds, but Meredith revealed that his father had a high opinion of me and was willing to provide capital if we formed a partnership. Meredith proposed that when his contract with Keimer ended in the spring, we could establish our own press and printing operation from London using my business acumen to compensate for his lack of skills, with profits divided equally between us. I provided an inventory to the father, which he took to a merchant, and the items were ordered while we kept the arrangement a secret until their arrival. Meanwhile, I was supposed to find work at another printing house, but couldn't due to no vacancies available. However, Keimer, in anticipation of a paper money printing job in New Jersey that would require my specialized skills, sent me a message asking for reconciliation and offering me a chance to return to his shop. The New Jersey printing job was secured, and I designed a copperplate press, the first in the country, which allowed me to create ornaments and checks for the bills. We traveled together to Burlington, where I successfully completed the work, and as a result, Keimer received a substantial payment that enabled him to manage his finances more effectively. In contrast, my intellectual development through readings surpassed that of Keimer's, likely contributing to the value my conversations were perceived as having. The committee members invited me to their homes, introduced me to their acquaintances, and showed me hospitality, whereas Keimer's was somewhat overlooked, despite being in charge. I spent approximately 3 months in that location, and during that time, I gained the acquaintance of notable individuals such as Judge Allen, Samuel Bustill, Isaac Pearson, Joseph Cooper, several Smiths, who were assembly members, and Isaac Decow, the provincial surveyor general. Decow was a perceptive elderly man who recounted his personal journey from humble beginnings in brickmaking to self-taught literacy, chain carriage for surveyors, and eventually learning surveying himself, ultimately acquiring a sizable estate through his diligence. He prophetically mentioned that I would soon surpass him in this profession and achieve financial success in Philadelphia, without any prior knowledge of my plans to establish myself there or elsewhere. Before beginning my public career, I'd like to provide insight into my mindset regarding principles and morality at the time, so you can see how they influenced the events that followed in my life. However, by the time I was around 15, after questioning various points as I read different books, I began to doubt the validity of Revelation itself. Although Revelation held no direct influence over me, I thought that actions might be good or bad regardless of religious dictates because their inherent nature could benefit or harm individuals. Soon after returning to Philadelphia, we received new printing types from London. We settled with Keimer, but left before he even knew about it. We found a house near the market and rented it for £24 per year, which later increased to £70. A well-known individual named Samuel Mickle, an elderly man with a serious demeanor, visited me unexpectedly in Philadelphia. However, years later, he surprisingly paid 5 times more for a property than it would have cost when he first began predicting the city's demise. The initial members consisted of Joseph Brandnall, a deed copyist who worked for Scrivener's, an amiable, sociable man in his middle age; Nicholas Scull, a land measurer surveyor, who later held the position of chief surveyor, had a passion for reading and occasionally composed short poems or verses; William Parsons, the son of a cobbler, developed an appreciation for books and learned a significant amount of mathematics, initially driven by an interest in astrology but later dismissed the subject as he found it lacking. William Moggridge is described as a skilled craftsman in woodworking joiner, a master of precise machinery operation, exquisite mechanic, and a dependable, down-to-earth individual with sound judgment, solid, sensible man. Robert Grace is a youthful individual with a comfortable financial situation, known for his kind-heartedness, vivacity, and cleverness in conversation. The club we formed continued almost as long, serving as the best educational institution for philosophy, morality, and politics in our province at the time. I'm sharing this anecdote to illustrate my dedication and perseverance during a critical period in our printing business. Brainall played a key role by securing the Quaker History Project, which involved printing 40 sheets before Keimer took over the rest. Interestingly, at the Merchants Every nightclub, many thought our printing business would fail given the existing competition from Keimer and Bradford. However, Dr. Baird, who later met me in St. Andrews, Scotland, disagreed that Franklin's industry is superior to anything I've ever seen. He works late into the night and is back at it before dawn. This endorsement led to an offer of stationery supplies, but we chose not to expand into retail at that time. I speak about this profession at length and openly, although it might sound like I'm boasting, so that my future descendants, if they read this, will understand the value of integrity by seeing how it has worked in my favor throughout this account. George Webb, who had secured funding from a female acquaintance to buy his freedom from Keimer, approached us looking for work as a journeyman. Although we couldn't employ him at the time, I confided in him my plans to start a newspaper and potentially offer him a job in the future. Webb instead shared this information with Keimer, who preemptively announced his own plans to launch a newspaper, employing Webb in the process. I took issue with Keimer's move and countered by writing engaging content for Bradford's paper under the pseudonym The Busybody. Brainall continued this feature for several months, drawing public attention to that publication and diminishing interest in Keimer's venture. Despite this, Keimer went ahead and started his newspaper, which struggled with only about 90 subscribers after a year. Eventually, he offered it to me at a low price, as I'd been preparing to launch a paper of my own for some time. I've noticed I often refer to myself alone, even though our partnership persists. This might be because the bulk of the business responsibilities rested on me. Meredith lacked the skills to compose typeset, was a poor pressman, and frequently intoxicated. Our initial publications stood out from others in the region. They featured superior typography and printing quality. They sparked lively discussions among prominent individuals, generating significant buzz around our newspaper and its manager. Although Bradford still printed official documents like votes, laws, and public announcements, he did so in a crude manner. They noticed the difference, which bolstered the confidence of our allies in the House, ultimately leading them to appoint us as their official printers for the following year. Among the House members I've known, I should mention Hamilton, whom I previously noted as having recently arrived from England and held a seat there. Mr. Meredith's father, who was supposed to fund our printing business, could only provide the initial £100 in currency and owed an additional 100 to the merchant, who grew impatient. This led us to post bail, but we realized that if we couldn't raise the funds on time, we risked facing a court judgment, potentially resulting in the sale of our press and equipment at a significantly reduced price, thereby jeopardizing our promising prospects. At a difficult time, two genuine friends, William Coleman and Robert Grace, separately approached me without my request, offering to provide any necessary funds for me to take full control of the business if feasible. However, they expressed concerns about maintaining the partnership with Meredith due to his frequent public intoxication and poor behavior, which reflected poorly on us. Although I felt indebted to the Merediths for their past actions and potential future contributions, my friends' offers weighed heavily on me. If the Merediths ultimately failed to fulfill their obligations and our partnership was dissolved, I would consider accepting my friends' assistance. The impasse continued until my partner expressed concerns about his father's dissatisfaction with his involvement in our venture, which would prevent him from securing financial backing. His proposal was for me to take over the company, repay his father's investment of £100, settle his personal debts, provide him with sturdy and a new saddle, in exchange for relinquishing his share. He later sent me detailed letters about the region's climate, soil, farming practices, and more, which I published in newspapers to great public interest. I used these funds to settle the company's debts, and then continued the business under my own name. I publicly advertised that our partnership was no longer in effect, which I believe occurred around 1729. As soon as he left, I returned to my two associates. To avoid showing favoritism, I took half of what each partner had proposed and combined them, some from one and part from the other. I used these funds to settle the company's debts, and then continued the business under my own name. I publicly advertised that our partnership was no longer in effect, which I believe occurred around 1729. Chapter 8. Business Success and First Public Service. Around this time there was a growing demand for more paper money in the region, as only 15,000 remained, soon to deplete its value. The wealthy community opposed increasing the paper currency, fearing depreciation similar to what happened in New England, which would harm all creditors. In my junta discussions, I advocated for an increase, convinced that the initial small sum introduced in 1723 had a positive impact on trade, employment, and population growth in the province. Today I see old homes occupied and new ones under construction, a stark contrast to when I first roamed Philadelphia streets, eating my roll. Back then most houses along Walnut Street between 2nd and Front Streets displayed to be let signs, as did many on Chestnut Street and other streets, leading me to believe the city was losing its inhabitants one by one. Around this time there was a growing demand for more paper money in the region, as only 15,000 remained, soon to deplete its value. The wealthy community opposed increasing the paper currency, fearing depreciation similar to what happened in New England, which would harm all creditors. In my junta discussions, I advocated for an increase, convinced that the initial small sum introduced in 1723 had a positive impact on trade, employment, and population growth in the province. Today I see old homes occupied and new ones under construction, a stark contrast to when I first roamed Philadelphia streets, eating my roll. Our discussions left such a profound impression on me that I anonymously published a pamphlet titled The Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency. The general public received it positively, but the wealthy community disliked it because it amplified the demand for more money. My contributions were recognized by friends in the House, who then hired me to print the currency, a lucrative opportunity that greatly benefited me. The value of this currency became increasingly clear over time, leading to widespread agreement and acceptance. Soon after, through my connection with Hamilton, I secured a lucrative contract to print the Newcastle paper money. At the time it seemed like a significant achievement to me, as people in modest situations often overestimate small gains. For me, these opportunities were substantial motivators. Additionally, Hamilton arranged for me to also print the government's laws and voting records, which remained in my possession as long as I continued with this line of work. I started to settle my debt for the printing press by being diligent and thrifty, both in reality and appearance. As a result, I earned a reputation as a hard-working and prosperous young man, which led merchants to seek out my custom for stationery and book supplies. Meanwhile, Keimer's fortunes declined, and he was forced to sell his printing press to pay off debts. I trained David Harry when we worked together, and he later set up a printing business in Philadelphia using the materials I taught him with. Harry led an extravagant lifestyle, accumulating debt, neglecting his business, and eventually losing clients. When no work was available, he joined Keimer in Barbados, bringing the printing press with him. At this point, the only rival I had in Philadelphia was Bradford, a wealthy and relaxed publisher who occasionally printed work on an ad hoc basis. I did send and receive papers via the post, but public perception was that I bribed writers to do so privately, while Bradford disallowed this practice. Eventually, it was time to discuss the marriage proposal, which Mrs. Godfrey managed. I requested that they provide as much money as would pay off my debt for the printing house, which wasn't more than $100. This led to tension between us, ultimately resulting in their departure and leaving me in sole possession of the house. My thoughts turned to marriage after this incident, so I started socializing in new places. As neighbors and old acquaintances, I had maintained a friendly correspondence with Mrs. Reed's family, who had always held me in high regard since my early days of lodging at their home. I reflected on my own inconsistency and inconstancy during my time in London, which had contributed to her unhappiness, although her mother kindly believed the fault lay more with herself than me, as she had delayed our marriage before I left for London and arranged another match while I was away. Fortunately, none of our anticipated difficulties materialized. Miss Reed proved a devoted and faithful partner, assisted me in managing the shop, and together we flourished. I proposed that since we frequently referred to our books during discussions, it would be practical to have them all together where we met, allowing us to consult them as needed. By pooling our books into a shared library, each of us could benefit from using the entire collection, almost like owning it collectively. Although the number wasn't as large as expected, some issues arose due to lack of proper care, so after about a year the shared library was disbanded, and each member reclaimed their books. I'm embarking on my first major public endeavor, establishing a subscription library. I drafted the proposal, refined it with the assistance of Brockton, our skilled scribe, and thanks to the support of my Junto friends, we secured 50 initial subscribers pledging 40 each up front, plus 15 annually for 50 years as long as our organization would operate. The subsequent portion was written many years later as a result of advice within these letters, aiming for public dissemination. Having my own papers at home would likely make this task easier, as they jog my memory and help me verify dates. Since my return is uncertain and I currently have some free time, I'll do my best to recall and write what I can. If I'm fortunate enough to return home, I may then correct and refine it further. Since I don't have access to prior writings on this topic, I'm unsure whether the methods used to establish the Philadelphia Public Library, which has grown significantly from its humble start around 1730, have been documented elsewhere. In New York and Philadelphia, the printers operated small stationery stores, offering limited stock-like paper, almanacs, ballads, and simple textbooks. I suggested we pool our book collections in the new space, making them accessible for consultation during meetings and allowing each member to borrow titles they wanted to read at home. I identified an opportunity to make reading more accessible and proposed starting a public subscription library in Philadelphia. Despite limited readership and financial constraints at the time, I managed to gather support from 50 mostly young tradesmen who each contributed 40 upfront and 10 annually. The library operated on a one-day-a-week loan basis, requiring subscribers to provide promissory notes and pay double the book's value, if not returned within the designated time. As these institutions grew through donations, reading became more fashionable, and our community's literacy and intelligence improved significantly within a few years. As we prepared to sign the documents that would be legally binding on ourselves, our heirs, and so on for 50 years, Mr. Brockton, the scribe, pointed out to us that despite being young men, it was unlikely any of us would live long enough to witness the expiration of the agreed term in the contract. While some of us are still alive today, the original agreement became void a few years later when a new charter granted perpetual status to the company. When asking for support, I initially felt self-conscious about promoting an idea that could benefit me personally or elevate my status among others, especially when relying on their help to achieve it. To overcome this, I disguised myself as the messenger of a collective effort, presenting it as a project proposed by friends who thought you and I shared a love for reading. My sole leisure activity was reading. I avoided taverns, games, and other forms of entertainment, focusing instead on maintaining an unwavering work ethic in my business. I faced challenges as a new printer, with 2 established competitors vying for customers, and had to support a growing family's education needs. Despite these obstacles, my financial situation gradually improved due to my continued frugality and adherence to the wisdom of Solomon, which emphasizes that diligence can lead to wealth and respect. We have an old English saying that goes, "To succeed, one must ask their wife." I was fortunate to have a spouse who shared my values of hard work and frugality. She willingly helped me with my business ventures like folding pamphlets, running the shop, and buying rags for papermakers. These principles were essential across all religions in our region, and while I respected each faith differently based on its moral focus, I avoided discussing religion in a way that might diminish someone's esteem for their own beliefs. As our community grew, new places of worship needed to be built, and I contributed, regardless of the denomination, ensuring no one was refused assistance. Although I rarely attended public worship services, I recognized the importance and value of them when conducted properly. Occasionally he would visit me as a friend and encourage me to attend his sermons, which I did on occasion, including 5 Sundays in a row. However, if he had been an engaging preacher, perhaps I would have continued attending despite my need for Sundays to focus on my studies. However, the preacher focused on only 5 points that he believed were implied by the apostle: keeping the Sabbath holy, diligently reading the scriptures, attending public worship, partaking in the sacrament, and showing respect to God's ministers. But before that, I had created my own private prayer book in 1728, called Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion. I returned to using it and no longer attended public worship. After a long time, he chose as his text Philippians 4:8, which says that we should focus on true, honest, just, pure, lovely, or praiseworthy things if there's any virtue or praise in them. I thought a sermon based on this verse would naturally include moral lessons. However, the preacher focused on only 5 points that he believed were implied by the apostle: keeping the Sabbath holy, diligently reading the scriptures, attending public worship, partaking in the sacrament, and showing respect to God's ministers. While these might be good things, they weren't what I expected from this text. As a result, I lost interest and stopped attending his sermons. But before that, I had created my own private prayer book in 1728, called Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion. I returned to using it and no longer attended public worship. My actions might be questionable, but I won't justify them further. Instead, I aim to simply recount the events without offering apologies for them. Chapter 9: Plan for Attaining Moral Perfection. Around this time, I decided to tackle the ambitious goal of achieving moral perfection. I aimed to live without making any mistakes at all, overcoming both my natural tendencies and the influences of habit and social norms. Since I believed I knew what was right and wrong, I saw no reason why I couldn't consistently do good and avoid evil. However, I soon discovered that this undertaking was far more challenging than I initially thought. While focusing on avoiding one mistake, I would often fall prey to another. Habitual behaviors would take advantage of my inattention, and strong inclinations would sometimes overpower reason. Ultimately, I realized that simply recognizing the benefits of being virtuous wasn't enough to prevent relapses. Rather, I needed to break bad habits and cultivate good ones before relying on a consistent display of moral character. To achieve this, I developed a specific method. Around this time, I decided to tackle the ambitious goal of achieving moral perfection. I aimed to live without making any mistakes at all, overcoming both my natural tendencies and the influences of habit and social norms. Since I believed I knew what was right and wrong, I saw no reason why I couldn't consistently do good and avoid evil. Ultimately, I realized that simply recognizing the benefits of being virtuous wasn't enough to prevent relapses. Rather, I needed to break bad habits and cultivate good ones before relying on a consistent display of moral character. To achieve this, I developed a specific method. As I read about moral virtues, I noticed different writers categorized them in varying ways, with some using fewer, more general terms, while others used more specific, detailed ones. For instance, temperance was sometimes limited to dietary habits, but other times encompassed moderation of all desires and passions. To achieve clarity, I decided to use a greater number of distinct virtue names, each with a narrower definition rather than a few broader categories. I compiled a list of 13 virtues that seemed essential or desirable at the time, accompanied by brief guidelines defining each one's scope. Only share words that can positively impact others or bring value to your own life. Steer clear of idle chatter. Don't spare any effort or resource in doing kindness towards others or improving your own life. In other words, be frugal and avoid wasting anything. Avoid causing harm through dishonesty. Approach conversations with a pure and fair mindset, and when expressing yourself, do so in a truthful and respectful manner. Don't wrong anyone by causing harm or neglecting to provide the good you're obliged to offer. Don't get worked up over small things or unexpected events that are a normal part of life. I aimed to develop all these virtues, but realized it was more effective to focus on one at a time, gradually working through the 13. Once temperate, silence became easier to achieve, allowing me to dedicate more time to my studies and project. Resolution, once habitual, ensured persistence in acquiring subsequent virtues. Frugality and industry freed me from financial burdens, making sincerity and justice easier to practice, and so on. This structured approach helped me track my development and stay committed to the cultivation of these virtues. I created a small book, dividing it into pages for each of the 7 virtues. I marked the start of each line with the first letter of a virtue. Using this system, I could record any faults I discovered by placing a small black dot in its designated space when a fault was committed on that particular day and concerning that specific virtue. I committed to dedicating 1 week at a time to cultivating each of the virtues, starting with temperance. During this initial period, I focused solely on not overindulging in food and drink, making mental notes of any slip-ups by evening. If I successfully kept my temperance line free from errors for that week, I assumed the associated habit had strengthened, while its opposite had weakened. This allowed me to expand my efforts to the next virtue in subsequent weeks, with the goal of completing a full cycle of 13 virtues within a year. By doing so, I hope to see my progress reflected on the pages of my journal as I gradually cleared each virtue line of imperfections, ultimately achieving a clean book. After 13 weeks of self-reflection and improvement, if such a superior force exists, it would take pleasure in moral goodness. Solomon's wise words from the book of Proverbs emphasize the importance of cultivating wisdom and moral excellence. In the context provided, it seems that Psalm 16 verses 16-17 describe God's benevolence as follows: God has the power to control the duration of life in one hand and wealth, honor, and other good things in the other hand. The original text can be paraphrased more freely like this: with one hand, God holds the length of our days, with the other riches, honor, and more. I considered God the source of wisdom, so I deemed it fitting and essential to seek his help in acquiring wisdom. O benevolent and all-powerful creator of light and life, I implore you to guide me in understanding what is truly good. According to the principle of maintaining order, I allocate specific times for all aspects of my life. Starting the day with a purposeful mindset, I pose to myself, what positive impact can I create today? Or how might I make a meaningful difference in my world today? Or even what noble deeds shall I undertake and bring to fruition this day? The intent is to cultivate a proactive attitude, focusing on actions that will have a beneficial influence on oneself and others. I embarked on a self-reflection process and consistently recorded my progress over time, despite occasional interruptions. Over time, I reduced the frequency of these self-examinations, from once a year to only occasionally due to commitments abroad, managing various tasks and voyages. However, I always carried my journal with me as a reminder. The author's biggest struggle is maintaining order in their daily life. The author notes that they've often been tempted to adopt a similar attitude, thinking that striving for perfection might be seen as foppish in moral character and lead to envy or hatred. Ultimately, the author chooses to persevere in their efforts to cultivate order and self-improvement despite the difficulties. In my later years, with a weakening memory, I've come to deeply appreciate the importance of order in life. Although I never achieved my goal of perfecting it, the effort has made me a better and happier person than I would have been without striving for it. Just as one who seeks to write like engraved copies may not attain perfection but still improves their handwriting through the attempt, so too did I benefit from aiming high, even if I didn't quite reach my aspirations, as long as the outcome remains legible and decent. It's possible that future generations will be interested in knowing that it was a combination of factors, with divine favor, that contributed to my good fortune throughout most of my life until I reached 79 years old when this is being written. Whatever challenges or hardships may still come are out of my control and in the hands of Providence. However, if they do arise, reflecting on the happiness I've experienced should make it easier for me to accept them with more resignation. I attribute my long-lasting health to temperance and a good constitution despite my advanced age to the same virtue. I believe it's a collective outcome of these virtues, though imperfectly developed in myself, that has given me an even temperament and the ability to converse cheerfully, making me still sought after by friends and acquaintances. This was intentional, as I believed my method could benefit people of all faiths, and I planned to publish it one day. My original plan was to write brief commentaries on virtues highlighting their benefits and the drawbacks of their opposites. The book would have been titled The Art of Virtue, as its focus would be on providing guidance for acquiring virtue, rather than simply urging moral goodness without offering practical advice. Despite my original plan, I never completed this writing project. Although I did jot down occasional notes on my thoughts and ideas, some of which still exist today, I was consistently sidetracked by personal matters in the early years and professional obligations since. My failure to complete it stems from its connection to a significant and ambitious undertaking that demanded my full focus. Unfortunately, unforeseen responsibilities prevented me from dedicating myself to this project, leaving it unfinished thus far. It also suggests that it's in everyone's self-interest to be virtuous even in this life to achieve happiness. Furthermore, recognizing that there is a constant need for trustworthy individuals among the wealthy and powerful, such as merchants, nobility, states, and princes, I aim to persuade young people that developing qualities like honesty, integrity, and probity could significantly improve their chances of financial success, regardless of their initial social status. Initially, my personal code of virtues consisted of 12 principles. My Quaker friend provided specific examples that had convinced me of my own prideful behavior. In response, I decided to work on eradicating this flaw, adding humility to my list of virtues, giving the concept a broad interpretation. I haven't necessarily achieved success in genuinely embodying this virtue, but I've made significant progress in appearing to. If someone expressed an opinion I disagreed with, I avoided immediate contradiction and instead started by acknowledging the validity of their perspective in certain circumstances, then subtly pointed out the differences as I saw them. Initially, I forced myself into a non-judgmental mindset, which over time became second nature. Even when a group works towards a shared goal, individual members have their own personal objectives and motivations at play. Once a group achieves its overall objective, individual members shift their focus to pursuing their personal agendas, which can undermine the efforts of others within the group, causing it to fracture and ultimately lead to even greater chaos. The majority in politics don't genuinely prioritize their nation's well-being, even if they claim otherwise. Instead, they usually align their personal and national interests, and their actions ultimately bring benefits to the country because it also serves them. Currently, it appears advantageous to establish a unified moral collective comprising virtuous individuals from around the world, governed by a set of rational and enlightened principles. I currently believe that anyone who strives to accomplish this with sincerity and the proper qualifications will undoubtedly earn divine approval and achieve their goals. As I contemplated this project for a later time when my situation permits, I scribbled down random thoughts on scraps of paper whenever they came to me about it. Most of these are now gone, but I did find one note that aimed to summarize the core beliefs of an intended creed, encompassing fundamental principles from all recognized religions and avoiding anything that might offend practitioners of any faith. God will unquestionably recompense moral excellence and hold accountable wickedness, either in this life or the afterlife. But before being initiated, each individual will need to not only agree with our core principles, but also demonstrate their commitment through 13 weeks of self-practice and testing of our moral values, as outlined in a previous example. As a distinguishing feature, we proposed calling ourselves the Society of the Free and Easy. This name conveys our liberation from vice through consistent practice of virtues like industry and frugality, which also frees us from debt's constraints, effectively ending our reliance on creditors. I did share parts of it with two young men who showed enthusiasm, but at the time my limited financial situation and need to focus on work prevented me from pursuing it further. My optimism wasn't deterred by the project scale, I've always thought one individual with average abilities can bring about significant change if they develop a solid plan, eliminate distractions, and dedicate themselves entirely to execution. This is the extent of my recollection about the project currently. I did share parts of it with two young men who showed enthusiasm, but at the time my limited financial situation and need to focus on work prevented me from pursuing it further. As a result, numerous tasks in both public and private spheres kept pushing the project aside until now, when I lack the physical strength and energy to undertake it. Nevertheless, I still believe it was a viable idea that could have positively impacted many lives by creating responsible citizens. My optimism wasn't deterred by the project scale. I've always thought one individual with average abilities can bring about significant change if they develop a solid plan, eliminate distractions, and dedicate themselves entirely to Chapter 10, Poor Richard's Almanac, and other activities. In 1732 I released my first almanac under the name Richard Saunders. Over the next 25 years I continued to publish it, earning the nickname Poor Richard's Almanac. I aimed to make it both enjoyable and informative, which led to its immense popularity. I sold around 10,000 copies each year. As the almanac was widely read across the province, I saw an opportunity to share valuable life lessons with the common people who didn't purchase many other books. To do this, I filled the calendar's small gaps with proverbs that emphasized the importance of hard work and thrift in achieving wealth and moral integrity, as exemplified by the saying, "An empty sack cannot stand upright." Over the next 25 years I continued to publish it, earning the nickname Poor Richard's Almanac. I aimed to make it both enjoyable and informative, which led to its immense popularity. I sold around 10,000 copies each year. As the almanac was widely read across the province, I saw an opportunity to share valuable life lessons with the common people who didn't purchase many other books. The piece gained widespread acclaim, being reproduced in all continental newspapers, printed on a broadside for posting in homes in Britain, and translated twice into French. I viewed my newspaper as an opportunity to share knowledge and wisdom with others. Occasionally I'd publish original pieces that were initially presented at our junto gatherings. These include a Socratic dialogue emphasizing the importance of moral character over intellectual prowess, as well as an essay on self-denial highlighting the significance of making virtue a consistent habit, rather than just occasional inclinations. You can find these writings in my newspaper from around the start of 1735. When asked to publish defamatory content, I'd counter by offering to print it separately if the author wanted widespread distribution. After his death, his widow took over the business, having learned about accounting in her native Holland. Her business management was so successful that she raised her children well, eventually buying the printing house from me and establishing her son in it. I bring this point up primarily to advocate for the importance of business education for young women. That this type of education would be more practical and beneficial for them in the event of widowhood, as it would protect them from financial losses due to deceitful men, and equip them to manage a successful trading company until their son is old enough to take over, ultimately securing the family's prosperity and wealth. An opponent recognized one of his sermons as being borrowed from another source, Dr. Foster's work, to be specific, which was previously published in a British review. Following our loss, he left the congregation in search of better opportunities, while I stopped attending but continued supporting the ministers financially for many years. In 1733, I started studying languages and quickly became proficient in French, enabling me to effortlessly read books in the language. Next, I tackled Italian, but my friend, who was learning it too, would often challenge me to play chess, eating into my study time. Later, with some effort, I also learned to read Spanish books. I've previously mentioned my limited formal education in Latin when I was young, after which I largely abandoned studying the language. This time I experienced more success due to the groundwork laid by my prior knowledge of these Romance languages, which had eased my path of learning. The author questions the conventional approach to learning languages, which prioritizes starting with Latin before moving on to other languages. Instead, they propose an alternative: start with a modern language like French or Italian and then move on to others, even if this means never getting to Latin. The author argues that this approach would still result in the acquisition of at least one useful modern language, unlike the current method where students often spend years learning Latin without significant progress, making their efforts seem wasted. However, I noticed that he was declining in health and expressed concern about the well-being of his 10-year-old son after his expected passing. His mother managed the printing shop until he grew old enough, at which point I helped him by providing a set of new typefaces, as the ones inherited from his father were worn out. In 1736, I suffered the loss of a 4-year-old son to smallpox, acquired through common exposure. Our exclusive club, the Junto, was so successful that some members wanted to bring in their friends, but this would exceed our initial limit of 12 people. I was initially opposed to expanding our group, so instead I proposed a plan for each member to create a separate, similar club, without revealing their connection to the Junto. The benefits of this approach included educating more young citizens through our methods, gathering insights on community sentiments through reports from each member's separate club, promoting personal interests and business by increased recommendations, and amplifying our influence in public affairs and charitable efforts by spreading the Junto's ideas throughout multiple clubs. These clubs proved valuable to their members, providing entertainment, knowledge, and insight, while also partially achieving our goals of shaping public opinion on specific issues. I will share specific examples of this impact at a later time. The following year, when my reappointment was proposed, a new member made a lengthy speech against me to support another candidate. And this outcome was more pleasing to me because, in addition to the compensation for my immediate duties as clerk, the position allowed me to maintain connections with the members and secure lucrative contracts such as printing votes, laws, paper money, and other occasional public tasks. I didn't appreciate the initial opposition from a new member of Parliament who was well-educated, wealthy, and destined for great influence within the House, which eventually came to pass. Upon returning the book with a heartfelt note of gratitude, our paths next crossed in the House, where he greeted me warmly and civilly for the first time. I accepted the role and found it beneficial as it improved my newspaper's correspondence, increased demand for it, and led to more advertisements, ultimately providing a substantial income. Spotswood initially refused to allow my papers on his postal riders, likely due to resentment over my success. However, I didn't retaliate, allowing him to suffer the consequences of his employees' poor accounting practices. This experience serves as a valuable lesson for young professionals. Always be meticulous with accounts and timely remittances, as it is a powerful recommendation for future opportunities and increased business. Chapter 11: Interest in Public Affairs. I started focusing on community matters, beginning with small issues. One of the first things I thought needed improvement was the city watch system. Currently, it's managed by local constables on a rotational basis, asking various housekeepers to assist for the night. Those who declined could pay a yearly fee of 6 shillings to be excused, supposedly for hiring substitutes. In reality, this fee significantly exceeded what was necessary and turned the constable position into a profitable one. The constables often recruited unscrupulous individuals as their watch in exchange for a drink, which made respectable housekeepers hesitant to participate. Moreover, many nights were spent drinking rather than performing the required patrols. I wrote a paper presenting these irregularities and emphasizing the unfairness of the 6-shilling tax on the constable system, highlighting that a poor widow paying to guard £50 worth of property was treated equally as a wealthy merchant paying to protect thousands of pounds worth of goods in his stores, despite their vastly different circumstances. This paper was intended for discussion at our Junto meeting. I wrote a paper presenting these irregularities and emphasizing the unfairness of the 6-shilling tax on the constable system, highlighting that a poor widow paying to guard £50 worth of property was treated equally as a wealthy merchant paying to protect thousands of pounds worth of goods in his stores, despite their vastly different circumstances. This concept gained approval from my Junto group, was shared with other clubs, but presented as their own initiatives. Although the plan wasn't immediately implemented, it helped condition people for the change, ultimately facilitating the passage of a law a few years later when our club members had gained more clout. Around this time, I wrote an article, initially presented at the Junto but later published, about various mishaps and carelessness that can lead to house fires, along with precautions and suggestions for prevention. This piece gained significant attention as a valuable resource, inspiring a plan to establish a company focused on prompt firefighting and mutual aid in securing and removing belongings during emergency. Soon, 30 individuals signed up for this initiative. Additionally, we agreed to meet monthly for social gatherings, discussing ideas and sharing insights on firefighting topics that could inform our actions in such situations. The initial purpose of this organization became apparent, leading to its rapid growth as people wanted to join beyond what we initially thought suitable for a single group. Now, over 50 years later, the original company I established, called the Union Fire Company, still thrives despite the passing of all its original members except myself and one other who is a year older. In fact, since these institutions began, the city has only suffered minimal losses due to fires, often containing blazes before they spread beyond the initial house and consume much of it. In 1739, Reverend George Whitefield arrived from Ireland and gained fame for his traveling sermons. Initially allowed to preach in some local churches, he eventually faced opposition from the clergy who refused him their pulpits. Initially, it was impractical to hold meetings outdoors, exposed to the elements. So, as soon as the idea to build a meeting house arose and people in charge began collecting donations, sufficient funds were quickly gathered to secure the land and construct the building. The building and its grounds were entrusted to a group of trustees, ensuring that any preacher from any religious background could use the space to address the people of Philadelphia. This was not intended as a haven for a specific denomination, but rather a community space for all residents. Therefore, even if a missionary from Constantinople wished to preach Islam, they would find a suitable pulpit available. When Mr. Whitefield departed, he continued preaching throughout the colonies all the way to Georgia. Many of these individuals lacked the skills or resilience to clear land and survive in their new environment, resulting in a significant number of deaths, leaving many orphan children without care. This poignant scene stirred Mr. Whitefield's benevolent heart to establish an orphanage in Georgia where the children could be supported and educated. Upon his return northward, he promoted this charitable cause through preaching and collected substantial donations, as his eloquence had a profound impact on both hearts and purses, I being one such example of his persuasive power. I initially opposed my friend's plan to design and build a house in Georgia because it seemed impractical due to the lack of materials and workers there at the time. I suggested building the house where we were and moving our children there instead. Later, when I attended one of his sermons, I noticed he was going to end it with a collection, so I secretly resolved not to give anything. But as the sermon progressed, my resistance softened, and I started with small change, copper coins. When he delivered another powerful oratory stroke, I felt ashamed and decided to donate more, silver dollars, eventually emptying all my pocket money, including gold coins, into the collection plate. Interestingly, a fellow club member shared my initial reservations about building in Georgia. He had emptied his pockets before attending the sermon out of caution, but during the service he was moved to give and asked a neighbor to lend him some money for that purpose. Some thought Mr. Whitefield might use his collected works for personal gain, but having worked closely with him, printing his sermons, journals, etc., I never doubted his integrity. One evening he preached from the courthouse steps in the heart of the city, attracting an enormous crowd that spilled onto surrounding streets. After frequently hearing him preach, I developed the ability to tell whether his sermons were new or ones he'd repeated during his travels. His delivery of familiar sermons had become so refined through numerous performances that every inflection, emphasis, and modulation of his voice was expertly executed, making it impossible not to be charmed by the sermon, even if one wasn't invested in the topic. A pleasure akin to listening to exceptional music. The author's written words occasionally worked against him, allowing his enemies to exploit unguarded statements or incorrect opinions expressed in his sermons. After the successful partnership in Carolina, I gained encouragement to form more partnerships and promote my skilled workmen by setting them up with their own printing houses in various colonies, on terms similar to our collaboration in Carolina. Most of these ventures thrived, allowing the entrepreneurs to purchase the business from me after 6 years and continue independently, thus creating a positive impact on several families. I'm grateful that all of my partnerships concluded harmoniously, which I attribute largely to meticulously outlining each partner's responsibilities and expectations in our agreements. This foresight I highly recommend, as even the most well-intentioned partners can fall prey to misunderstandings, rivalries, or feelings of unfairness, potentially leading to damaged relationships, lawsuits, and other unpleasant outcomes. Chapter 12. Defense of the Provinces. I felt content with my life in Pennsylvania overall, but I had two main concerns: the lack of provisions for defense and education. There was no militia and no college, which prompted me to propose an academy in 1743, considering Reverend Mr. Peters a suitable overseer. However, he declined, opting for a more lucrative opportunity serving the proprietaries. As I couldn't find another suitable candidate at the time, I put my plan on hold. The following year, 1744, I had better success establishing a philosophical society and left a written proposal for that endeavor to be included in my collected works if they're ever published. After several years of war with Great Britain and France's involvement putting us at risk, I decided to take matters into my own hands, since our Governor Thomas was unsuccessful in convincing the Quaker Assembly to pass defense-related laws. The pamphlet had an unexpected impact. People wanted the association instrument, which I prepared with friends and scheduled a public meeting at a large building. The company officers in Philadelphia's regiment met and selected me as their colonel, but I declined the role, deeming myself unfit, and instead recommended Mr. Lawrence, a respected individual with influence, who was then appointed to the position. I proposed a lottery to raise funds for building a battery below town and equipping it with cannons. As representatives of the associators, Colonel Lawrence, William Allen, Abram Taylor, myself, and others traveled to New York to request cannon from Governor Clinton. We promptly transported these high-quality 18-pound cannons with their carriages and mounted them in our battery, where associators maintained a night watch throughout the war, including myself, who took regular turns serving as a common soldier among the guards. This move allowed local clergy to encourage their congregations to participate in the association, and it likely would have been widely supported by all except Quakers, if not for the onset of peace soon after. Some friends thought that by being involved in certain matters, I would alienate a particular group and lose their support in the provincial assembly where they held the majority. However, I replied that I admired a public figure's principle of never seeking or refusing an office and always keeping it when offered. Perhaps my increased involvement with the Council of Governors during their disputes over military preparations created some tension, but ultimately they didn't want to replace me solely due to my association activities or lack a clear reason for doing so. However, my findings showed a significant number of them, despite being against aggressive wars, were actually supportive of defensive measures. Many pamphlets debating the topic were published, and some well-regarded Quakers even wrote in favor of defense, likely persuading many younger members of this group. A proposal was made to invest our current funds in lottery tickets to support building a battery, pending our next meeting as per our rules. The company consisted of 30 members, with 22 being Quakers and 8 from other persuasions. All 8 non-Quaker members attended the meeting, but we were uncertain about gaining a majority despite believing some Quakers might join us. Only one Quaker, James Morris, actively opposed the measure, expressing regret that it was proposed, as he claimed all friends were against it, and it would cause division, potentially disbanding our company. When the time came for voting, James Morris allowed us to proceed according to our rules, but suggested granting more time for opposing Quakers to arrive, considering he knew some members intended to be present specifically to vote against it. I went down to find they represented 8 fellow Quakers gathered at a nearby tavern, eager to vote in support if needed, but hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Considering the 22 Quakers present, 8 were prepared to support us while 13 chose not to attend, indicating they didn't object to our proposal. Later, I estimated that only 1 in 21 sincere Quaker members opposed defense efforts, all regular attendees of good reputation within their community and aware of the proposition before the meeting. Mr. Logan, a respected and learned Quaker, wrote in support of defensive war and used convincing arguments to back his stance. Mr. Logan shared an anecdote about his former employer, William Penn, involving a defense situation during wartime. When their ship was mistakenly believed to be under attack by an enemy vessel, James Logan, then serving as secretary, chose to remain on deck and was assigned to a gun, unlike the other Quakers who retreated to the cabin. Afterward, William Penn publicly rebuked James for his actions, considering them contrary to Quaker principles, even though the captain hadn't requested help. Throughout my lengthy time in the Assembly, with most of those years spent amidst Quaker majority presences, I witnessed their struggles when faced with requests from the Crown to provide financial support for military endeavors. As adherents to a principle opposing war, they found themselves caught between not wanting to offend the government by refusing outright and not wishing to compromise their beliefs by consenting in a manner contrary to those principles. For instance, when New England asked Pennsylvania for gunpowder to supply Lewisburg's garrison, Governor Thomas urged the House to grant the aid, but since money couldn't be used for war supplies, they voted £3,000 to the governor, specifying it be spent on bread, flour, or grain. Some council members tried to further complicate matters by advising the governor not to accept provisions, as they didn't match the original request. However, the governor replied that he understood their intention and would still use the funds wisely. In this case, he bought grain, which could also be used for gunpowder, without objection. It was to illustrate a point about the lottery that I made a comment to my friend Mr. Singh about our fire company's proposal potentially failing and suggested using the funds to buy a fire engine, which Quakers wouldn't object to. Mr. Singh replied that I had cleverly come up with an ambiguous project that would be comparable in its deceitfulness to the Quakers' misleading practices in their grain or other agricultural dealings. The Quakers' public stance against war led to embarrassment when they later changed their views, much like the Dunkers experienced unfair criticism for their principles without clearly publishing them. The Quakers are an exception, having recently refrained from public offices and positions to maintain their principles, rather than compromise by taking power at the cost of their convictions. To boost demand even further, I authored and published a pamphlet titled An Account of the New Invented Pennsylvania Fireplaces. This publication detailed the stove's construction, operation, advantages, and addressed any objections raised against them. However, I declined adhering to a principle that guided my actions. As we benefit from others' inventions, it's only right to share our own innovations freely and generously, rather than seeking exclusive control or financial gain. In London, an ironmonger adapted some ideas from my pamphlet, modified a machine, and obtained a patent for it, despite the changes making it less effective. He reportedly earned a small fortune from it. This isn't the only instance where others have patented my inventions without me contesting it, as I don't seek personal gain from patents and dislike disputes. The widespread use of these fireplaces in many homes, both here and in neighboring colonies, has significantly reduced wood consumption for residents. Chapter 13, Public Services and Duties, 1749-1753. Once the association agreement had been settled, I refocused on establishing an academy. To start, I enlisted a group of supportive friends, many from the Junto group. Next, I wrote and published a pamphlet called Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania. I distributed these proposals for free among the community's leaders, allowing them time to consider the ideas before moving forward. Once they had been exposed to the concept, I launched a subscription campaign to fund the Academy's opening and operation, with payments spread out over 5 years. This approach allowed us to collect a larger sum, totaling around $5,000 if my memory serves, which was a significant amount at that time. Next, I wrote and published a pamphlet called Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania. I distributed these proposals for free among the community's leaders, allowing them time to consider the ideas before moving forward. Once they had been exposed to the concept, I launched a subscription campaign to fund the Academy's opening and operation, with payments spread out over 5 years. This approach allowed us to collect a larger sum, totaling around $5,000 if my memory serves, which was a significant amount at that time. In the initial presentation of these ideas, I emphasized that they were published by a group of public-minded individuals, not by me personally. This was consistent with my general practice of minimizing self-promotion and avoiding direct credit for proposals aimed at benefiting the public. Once completed and signed, we rented a building, hired teachers, and inaugurated the school in the same year, likely 1749. The founders ensured a fair representation in the selection of trustees for this building by representing all major denominations equally, so as to prevent any one group from dominating or eventually taking over the property for their exclusive use. Several individuals were proposed and rejected, but when one suggested me, noting I was a straightforward person with no particular affiliation, that won over the group to choose me. By then the enthusiasm surrounding the original building had waned, and the trustees struggled to gather funds to pay off debts and rent, which put them in a difficult situation. As a trustee for both the building and the academy, I was well positioned to negotiate with both parties. Eventually, an agreement was reached where the building's trustees would transfer ownership to the academy's trustees, who would assume the debt, maintain a large hall for occasional preachers, and run a free school for underprivileged children. As the project leader, I oversaw the workmen, materials procurement, and construction supervision, a task I approached with more enthusiasm since it didn't interfere with my personal business at the time. The year prior, I had partnered with Mr. David Hall, an industrious individual known for his honesty, who took over management of my printing office, ensuring timely payments of our shared profits. The founding academy eventually obtained a charter from the governor after some time. I've been a trustee since its inception, nearly 40 years ago, and it's been a genuine delight to witness many alumni having received their education there excel in their abilities, hold prominent roles, and bring honor to their nation. The governor appointed me to a peace commission. The city council chose me as an alderman, and the citizens elected me as their representative in the assembly. The following year, a treaty was scheduled to take place with Native Americans at Carlisle. In response, the governor sent a message to the House of Representatives, suggesting that they appoint some members to join council representatives as commissioners for the negotiations. The House selected the Speaker, Mr. Norris, and myself, and once commissioned, we traveled to Carlisle to meet with the Native American delegation as planned. In 1751, my acquaintance Dr. Thomas Bond originated the idea of building a hospital in Philadelphia, aimed at providing care for impoverished patients regardless of their residency or origin. Dr. Bond diligently sought donations but initially faced limited success due to the innovative proposal being unfamiliar and misunderstood in America. He explained that whenever he proposes a project to potential donors and asks for their support, they often ask if I've been consulted or what I think of the idea. Curious about his proposal, I asked him about its nature and potential benefits, and upon receiving a satisfactory explanation, not only did I support it financially but also actively worked to gather additional backing from others. But before initiating the solicitation process, I typically take steps to prepare the public by writing articles on the subject in newspapers, a practice he hadn't followed in this instance. Initially, rural representatives were not enthusiastic about the idea, arguing it would primarily benefit the city and therefore the citizens should cover the costs alone. These conditions include the contributors' selection of managers and a treasurer, their collective raising of a capital stock valued by its yearly interest, and this value being verified as satisfactory by the Assembly Speaker. Upon fulfilling these requirements, the Speaker is obligated to sign an order for the provincial treasurer to pay the $2,000 to the hospital's treasurer, to be used for establishing, building, and completing the hospital. This conditional promise motivated people to donate more generously, exceeding the required sum, and enabling us to receive public funding for our project. The resulting building was well received, and the institution thrived over time. Around this time, Reverend Gilbert Tennant approached me seeking assistance to raise funds for building a new church for his Presbyterian congregation, originally founded by Whitefield's followers. He then asked for a list of generous individuals I knew, but I refused, not wanting to expose them to further requests after they had already supported me. Reverend Tennant laughed, thanked me, and took my advice, ultimately collecting a larger sum than expected, which enabled him to build the impressive and elegant meeting house in Arch Street. Our city, despite its well-designed grid layout, had an embarrassing issue. Its unpaved streets turned into muddy quagmires in wet weather and dusty messes in dry weather. This provided a dry and easy access to the market for some time, but since the rest of the street remained unpaved, carriages would exit the mud onto this new pavement, leaving dirt behind, and it soon became muddy again. Unfortunately, our city lacked scavengers at that time to clean up the mess. After investigating, I discovered an industrious individual willing to maintain the pavement by sweeping twice a week, removing dirt from in front of each house for a monthly fee of 6 pence per household. I then created a pamphlet highlighting the benefits of this small investment: improved cleanliness at homes, increased shop business due to easier accessibility, and reduced dust blowing into goods during windy weather. This success sparked a broader desire for all streets to be paved, making citizens more willing to accept a tax for that purpose. I introduced a bill for the city's paving and street lighting, which was eventually passed after I left for England in 1757. A private individual, Mr. John Clifton, is actually credited with sparking the idea of citywide street lighting by installing a lamp at his doorstep. My contribution was in suggesting a design improvement over the initial globe lamps from London, which had airlock issues, needed frequent cleaning, and were prone to breaking easily. I proposed a revised design featuring flat panes, a long funnel, and crevices for air intake and smoke ascent, resulting in cleaner, more durable, and efficient street lamps. I've often pondered why Londoners didn't adopt the design feature found in globe lamps at Vauxhall, which helps keep them clean by allowing excess liquid to drain out through holes at the bottom. Consequently, after just a few hours of use, London street lamps become dimly lit due to lack of airflow and accumulated smoke. The discussion about these advancements reminds me of an idea I proposed in London to the esteemed Dr. Fothergill, a brilliant individual who championed various beneficial initiatives. At the time, I noticed that the dry streets were never swept, allowing light dust to linger. However, it was only cleared when rain turned it into mud, leaving it on the pavement for days. The reason given for not sweeping dry streets was that the dust might blow into shop and home windows. I offered to pay her a shilling if she cleaned the entire street. She completed the task in 3 hours, despite initially appearing slow due to her frailty. I concluded that if a woman could clean a street in 3 hours with her limited strength, a man should be able to accomplish the same task in only 1.5 hours given his greater physical capabilities. This is because a single channel allows rainwater from both sides to converge and create a stronger, more effective current for cleaning away mud. Conversely, dividing the water into 2 channels often results in insufficient flow to clean either side properly, leaving the mud merely liquefied and then spread by carriages and horses onto the sidewalk, making it dirty and slippery at times. To improve street cleaning in London and Westminster, it suggested that watchmen be hired on contract to sweep up dust during dry seasons and remove mud at other times in the specific streets and alleys within their designated areas. Instead of leaving muddy waste in piles on the streets, a more efficient system would utilize flat, low-to-the-ground carts with lattice bottoms covered in straw. Since then, I've questioned the feasibility of the proposal's latter part due to the constraints of some streets and the challenge of positioning drainage sleds without hindering traffic. This conclusion was formed after observing on a morning at 7 a.m. in areas like the Strand and Fleet Street. Not a single shop was open despite the sun rising over 3 hours prior. With these thoughts in mind, I've shared my observations, hoping they may offer practical insights for a city I love, having lived there happily for many years, as well as for some American towns. To achieve this, several improvements were needed, some of which initially incurred significant costs. Consequently, within 4 years, the office accumulated a debt of over $900 to us. However, the office began repaying its debts and eventually generated 3 times more revenue for the British Crown than the Irish Post Office. Unfortunately, my subsequent dismissal led to a decline in performance, and since then no payment has been received from the American office. I embarked on a trip to New England this year due to business with the post office. During my visit, Cambridge College spontaneously awarded me a Master of Arts degree, following a similar honor from Yale College in Connecticut earlier. I attained these academic distinctions without formal college studies because of my significant contributions and discoveries in the field of electric natural philosophy. Chapter 14: Albany Plan of Union. In 1754, there was a concern that war with France might break out again, so the British Lords of Trade ordered a Congress of colonial representatives to gather in Albany to discuss defense strategies with Six Nations chiefs. Upon receiving this order, Governor Hamilton informed the Pennsylvania House and asked for their approval and funding for gifts to be given to the Indians during these talks. He also requested that the Speaker, Mr. Norris, and I join Mr. Thomas Penn and Secretary Peters as Pennsylvania's representatives at this meeting. The House agreed with the nomination, procured the necessary goods, and although they initially hesitated about holding such a meeting outside of the province, we met with the other commissioners in Albany around mid-June. In 1754 there was a concern that war with France might break out again, so the British Lords of Trade ordered a Congress of colonial representatives to gather in Albany to discuss defense strategies with Six Nations chiefs. The original proposal outlined a structure for the general government, where a president appointed and funded by the British Crown would work alongside a Grand Council chosen by representatives from each colony's assembly. This plan was debated concurrently with Indian Affairs in Congress, and despite initial objections, it ultimately gained unanimous approval to be sent to the Board of Trade and provincial assemblies. However, both parties rejected the plan. The assemblies deemed it too monarchical, while the Board of Trade found it too democratic. During Boston's cold winter, I had lengthy discussions with Governor Shirley about our plans. If the colonies had united under this plan, they'd have been strong enough to defend themselves without needing British troops, thus avoiding the subsequent justification for taxing America and the ensuing bloodshed. As a result, the most effective and beneficial policies tend not to arise from deliberate planning, but rather emerge as a response to pressing circumstances. The Pennsylvania governor endorsed a plan, praising its clarity and thoughtful design, suggesting the Assembly thoroughly consider it. As a result, the House rejected the plan without giving it proper thought, causing me significant disappointment. The Pennsylvania governor endorsed a plan, praising its clarity and thoughtful design, suggesting the Assembly thoroughly consider it. Unfortunately, when I was away, a particular representative brought it up for discussion, which I felt was unfair. As a result, the House rejected the plan without giving it proper thought, causing me significant disappointment. Chapter 15: Quarrels with the Proprietary Governors. During a trip to Boston this year, I had the chance to meet with our new governor, Mr. Morris, in New York. He recently arrived from England and was familiar to me due to past interactions. His primary task was to replace Mr. Hamilton, who resigned due to disputes stemming from his proprietary instructions. When I asked if he expected a similarly uncomfortable tenure, I advised him that he could have a comfortable administration if he avoided disagreements with the Assembly. Mr. Morris joked about my suggestion, saying how could he avoid debating when it's one of his greatest pleasures? However, he agreed to try and show respect for my counsel. As an eloquent and skilled debater, Mr. Morris had developed this talent from a young age. His father even encouraged sibling debates at mealtimes. I believe that tendency might have adverse effects in the long run, as those who argue excessively often fail to build good relationships or achieve lasting success. Mr. Morris departed for Philadelphia, while I continued on to Boston. During a trip to Boston this year, I had the chance to meet with our new governor, Mr. Morris, in New York. His primary task was to replace Mr. Hamilton, who resigned due to disputes stemming from his proprietary instructions. When I asked if he expected a similarly uncomfortable tenure, I advised him that he could have a comfortable administration if he avoided disagreements with the Assembly. Mr. Morris joked about my suggestion, saying how could he avoid debating when it's one of his greatest pleasures? Mr. Morris departed for Philadelphia, while I continued on to Boston. Upon my return to New York, I found the Assembly votes revealed a power struggle between the leader and the House, which persisted throughout his tenure in government. Given my role as the Assembly's writer, one might have expected animosity when we met. However, despite the intense debate, our leader was a kindly person and no personal rift developed between us. I retorted that the governor hadn't yet successfully tarnished their reputation. In fact, the Assembly had been actively countering his attempts and retaliating by painting him in an unfavorable light. I apologize for rushing through the narrative. I need to highlight several key events that took place under Governor Morris's leadership, which are just as crucial to the story as what has already been shared. Since I was a member of the Assembly, familiar with its dynamics, and a countryman of Mr. Quincy who approached me for my influence, I helped him craft an effective address that was well received. The Assembly agreed to provide 10,000 in provisions, but the governor refused to sign the bill into law unless it included an exemption clause protecting the proprietary estate from taxation. This left the Assembly uncertain about how to proceed with their intended grant to New England despite their eagerness. Mr. Quincy also struggled to convince the governor to reconsider his stance, but the governor remained firm in his opposition. I proposed an alternative way to handle the matter without the governor, by issuing orders on the loan office trustees, which the Assembly had the right to do according to law. The Assembly quickly agreed and printed the orders. I was part of the committee responsible for signing and distributing them. Mr. Quincy returned to express gratitude to the Assembly in a heartfelt address, was delighted with his diplomatic achievement, and thereafter maintained a warm and affectionate friendship towards me. I proposed an alternative way to handle the matter without the governor, by issuing orders on the loan office trustees, which the Assembly had the right to do according to law. Since there wasn't much money available at the time, I suggested these orders be payable in a year with a 5% interest rate. This would enable us to purchase provisions easily. The Assembly quickly agreed and printed the orders. I was part of the committee responsible for signing and distributing them. The fund for settling the debt came from the interest on all paper currency in circulation, plus excise revenue, which was known to be sufficient, giving the orders instant credibility. They not only served as payment for provisions, but also attracted investors seeking a secure, interest-bearing asset that could be easily converted back into cash when needed. As a result, they were quickly sold out, and soon none remained. Through this success, I effectively resolved the matter. Mr. Quincy returned to express gratitude to the Assembly in a heartfelt address, was delighted with his diplomatic achievement, and thereafter maintained a warm and affectionate friendship towards me. Chapter 16 Braddock's Expedition. The British government was hesitant to let the colonies unite as proposed at Albany, fearing increased military strength and potential suspicions among them. To counter this, they sent General Braddock with 2 English regiments to maintain control. He arrived in Virginia and marched to Maryland's Fredericktown, awaiting transportation. Upon hearing rumors that he harbored negative feelings towards them, the local assembly wanted me to visit him under the guise of discussing mail delivery between his location and provincial governors, which they would fund. My son joined me on this trip. To counter this, they sent General Braddock with 2 English regiments to maintain control. We located general forces in Fredericktown, eagerly anticipating the return of those sent to gather wagons from Maryland and Virginia's back regions. I stayed with him for several days, dining daily and gaining a chance to dispel his misconceptions by sharing assembly actions taken before and during my stay, which aimed to facilitate his operations. Upon my departure, the reported wagon returns showed only 25, of which not all were in working order. The general and officers were shocked, concluding the expedition was no longer feasible and criticizing ministers for mistakenly placing them in an area lacking necessary resources, requiring at least 150 wagons. I was instructed to determine the fair terms for hiring the wagons and put them in writing. The specific terms will be included in an advertisement I published when I arrived at Lancaster, which had an unexpected significant impact. I am authorized by General Braddock to negotiate for the hiring of wagons and horses for His Majesty's forces gathering at Wills Creek. The terms are as follows. 1. Wagons with 4 horses and a driver will cost 0.25 per day, pack or saddle horses, 0.3 per day, and individual horses without saddles, 0.225 per day. 2. The value of each wagon, team, or horse will be determined by impartial assessors chosen between me and the owner, and in case of loss, the agreed-upon price will be paid. 3. A week's pay can be requested up front, and the remaining payment will be made upon discharge, or as needed by General Braddock or the Army's paymaster. 4. Wagon and horse drivers will not be required to perform military duties. All excess forage brought to camp will be taken for the Army's use and reasonable compensation paid. During my recent visit to the camp in Frederick, I observed high-ranking officials and officers to be deeply frustrated due to the lack of available horses and carriages. These were expected to come from this region as it was believed to have the necessary resources. However, the ongoing disagreements between the governor and assembly hindered efforts, ultimately preventing the allocation of funds or any measures being taken to resolve the issue. A plan was suggested to dispatch a military contingent promptly to those regions, with the goal of requisitioning the finest carriages and horses required, and compelling individuals to enlist in order to handle and maintain these assets. I realized that British soldiers' passage through our counties during such an event, considering their current state and animosity towards us, would likely cause numerous difficulties for the local residents. The people from these rural areas have recently expressed concerns about the lack of a sufficient currency. You now have the chance to receive and distribute a significant sum among yourselves since, if this expedition persists, as it most likely will, the cost of hiring wagons and horses for 120 days would total over 70,000, which would be paid in silver and gold from the king's treasury. The wagons and pack animals carrying essential supplies must keep pace with the troops, and for their protection, are strategically placed both during marches and when camping, always prioritizing their safety. A small group of individuals, each contributing a wagon, horses, or driver, could collectively provide what's needed with proportional pay. It's crucial to supply wagons and horses. Reluctant compliance might lead to forceful measures, leaving you to seek recompense as you can, potentially without much sympathy or concern. If my approach to securing wagons and horses doesn't work out, I'll need to inform the general within 2 weeks. They might send Sir John Sinclair and his troops into the province then, which would sadden me since I genuinely care about you as a friend and well-wisher. I was given around £100 by the general to distribute as advance payments to wagon owners and others. Yet this amount proved insufficient, so I added over 200 more. Within 2 weeks, the 150 wagons and 259 carrying horses set out for the camp. The advertisement guaranteed payment based on valuation in case of loss, but the owners, citing uncertainty about General Braddock's reliability, requested a personal bond from me to ensure fulfillment, which I provided. While dining with Colonel Dunbar's officers, he expressed his worry about the junior officers' financial struggles in a costly country where they couldn't afford to stockpile supplies for a long march through the wilderness without access to purchases. The committee agreed and took prompt action, enabling my son to deliver the 20 parcels of supplies to the camp as quickly as the wagons arrived, each parcel containing. The general was pleased with my efforts in securing wagons and other services, promptly settling my expenses while thanking me repeatedly and requesting further assistance in supplying provisions. I took on this responsibility, expending over some thousand of my own funds, which I later detailed to the general. George Crotin, our skilled Indian interpreter, accompanied him on his campaign with 100 local guides who could have greatly benefited his army as scouts, interpreters, etc., had he treated them with kindness. Instead, he disregarded and neglected them, leading to their gradual abandonment of the general's cause. He expected to take Duquesne within 3 or 4 days, leaving nothing else to hinder his march to Niagara. However, I only expressed my concerns by saying that if he arrived at Duquesne quickly with his well-equipped troops and artillery, it would likely fall easily due to its incomplete fortifications and weak garrison. Contrary to my expectations, the enemy did not attack the long line of British soldiers as they marched, waiting instead until the army was within 9 miles of its destination. When the front of the army had almost fully crossed a river and was in an open area of woods, the enemy launched a surprise attack on the advanced guard with a heavy barrage from behind trees and bushes. This was the first sign to the general that the enemy was near. The disordered guard prompted the general to hasten the troops' approach to help, which they did amidst chaos caused by wagons, baggage, and livestock. The wagon drivers hastily removed their horses from the teams and fled, prompting others to do the same, leaving the enemy in possession of all wagons, provisions, artillery, and supplies. The general was wounded and struggled to be evacuated, while his secretary was killed beside him. Out of 86 officers, 63 were either killed or wounded, and 714 out of 1,100 soldiers perished. The fleeing soldiers reached Dunbar's camp without being pursued, spreading panic among his troops. Despite having over 1,000 men at his disposal, and knowing that their adversary had only around 400 Indians and French combined, who previously defeated Braddock, Dunbar ordered all supplies to be destroyed, so he could have more horses for his hasty retreat towards the settlements. En route, governors from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania requested that he position his troops along the frontier to protect the inhabitants. However, Dunbar continued his rapid march, only feeling safe once he reached Philadelphia, where its residents could safeguard him. Captain Orme, who served as an aide-de-camp to General Orme and was severely injured alongside him, remained by the general's side until his own death, which occurred shortly thereafter. The enemy obtained the secretary's documents containing general's orders and communications. I noticed that some of these documents included the general's letters to the ministry praising my contributions to the army and recommending me for recognition. Being at Philadelphia during his retreat, I asked him to discharge 3 poor farmers' servants from Lancaster County that he had recruited, reminding him of the previous general's orders on this matter. When news of the lost wagons and horses spread, all the owners came after me demanding the valuation I had bonded for, causing me a great deal of distress. I explained that the money was ready with the paymaster but needed General Shirley's order to release it. I assured them I'd written to him, but an answer would take time. Fortunately, General Shirley intervened by appointing commissioners to review the claims and authorize payment. But before a recent loss in battle, the 2 doctors Bond approached me with a petition to raise funds for a grand fireworks display, intended to celebrate our capture of Fort Duquesne once news arrived. The Assembly remained steadfast in their refusal to include an exemption clause, convinced they were on moral ground and wouldn't compromise a fundamental right by allowing the governor to amend their revenue bills. In one of their last attempts, Governor Morris proposed a minor amendment to a bill that aimed to raise $50,000, changing read to not read in a sentence stating all the states would be taxed, including those of the proprietaries. This outcry intimidated the proprietors, who responded by instructing their receiver general to contribute an additional $5,000 from their funds to any sum granted by the Assembly for defense purposes. Upon notification to the House, an agreement was reached, substituting their share of a general tax for a new bill with an exemption clause, which subsequently passed. As a result, I was appointed one of the commissioners responsible for managing a £60,000 fund. Upon notification to the House, an agreement was reached, substituting their share of a general tax for a new bill with an exemption clause, which subsequently passed. As a result, I was appointed one of the commissioners responsible for managing a £60,000 fund. Having played a key role in drafting and securing passage of the original bill, I also introduced a separate proposal to establish and regulate a voluntary militia, which easily cleared the House due to its Quaker-friendly provisions. To facilitate the formation of the Militia Association, I authored a dialogue addressing common objections, had it printed, and believed it greatly contributed to the effort's success. Chapter 17, Franklin's Defense of the Frontiers. The governor convinced me to take charge of our northwestern frontier, which was plagued by enemy threats, and ensured the safety of its residents by recruiting troops and constructing fortifications. Despite not considering myself well suited for military leadership, I accepted this challenge with a full commission and authority to appoint officers as needed. I successfully rallied 560 men under my command. My son, who had previously served in an army against Canada, served as my aide-de-camp and proved invaluable. The Indians had razed the Moravian settlement of Gnadenhutten, killing its inhabitants, but we deemed the location suitable for a fort. The governor convinced me to take charge of our northwestern frontier, which was plagued by enemy threats, and ensured the safety of its residents by recruiting troops and constructing fortifications. Despite not considering myself well suited for military leadership, I accepted this challenge with a full commission and authority to appoint officers as needed. The Indians had razed the Moravian settlement of Gnadenhutten, killing its inhabitants, but we deemed the location suitable for a fort. To prepare for travel, I gathered my troops at Bethlehem, the main settlement of those people. They even placed small stones between the windows of their stone houses for women to use as projectiles against any intruding Indians. In early January, we embarked on constructing forts. I dispatched one group toward Minisink with orders to build a fort for the region's safety, and another group to the lower area with similar instructions. Deciding to lead the remaining troops myself, we headed to Gnadenhutten, where a fort was deemed crucially needed. Just before departing Bethlehem, A group of 11 displaced farmers sought my help to obtain firearms so they could retrieve their cattle from the Indians who had driven them out. As we began our march, a heavy downpour started and persisted throughout the day, leaving us exposed on the open road until we reached a German's house near nightfall. Thankfully, we weren't attacked during this time because our firearms were basic and our men struggled to keep their gun locks dry due to the rain. The Indians, on the other hand, had clever ways to maintain their guns' functionality in wet conditions, which proved crucial. On that day, the Indians encountered the same 11 farmers who had approached me for help, and managed to kill 10 of them. The following day, with a pleasant weather, we proceeded on our journey and reached the deserted settlement of Knightenhutton. The next day, our fort's layout was planned and marked out, requiring 455 feet of palisades made from trees 1 foot in diameter each. I even measured the time it took 2 men to fell a pine tree, just 6 minutes for a 14-inch diameter trunk. Once in place, our carpenters constructed a stage that would serve as the fort's foundation. Inside, we constructed walls about 6 feet high for the men to stand on while firing through loopholes. We had one swivel gun which we installed at an angle and immediately fired it to alert any nearby Indians of our artillery presence. In a week's time, despite frequent heavy rainstorms that prevented work on alternate days, our makeshift fortification was complete, or, as I'll call it, our humble stockade. During workdays, individuals displayed good-naturedness and cheerfulness, and their evenings were spent in a jovial atmosphere after completing a fulfilling day's labor. In contrast, idle days led to complaints about food, moodiness, and a general lack of harmony among them. When his first mate informed him that there were no more tasks to be done, the captain replied, "Have them clean the anchor," implying that idle hands can lead to discontent. We occupied a seemingly insignificant fort, which proved sufficient against the Indians since they lacked cannons. Although we didn't encounter any Indians, we discovered their lookout points on nearby hills where they had been observing us. It seemed that, given our numbers, the Indians deemed an attack impractical and decided not to engage us. I suggested to Mr. Beatty that if he distributed the rum immediately after prayers, it might encourage more attendance. As a result, his prayer sessions became better attended and punctual, making this approach more effective than punishment for non-attendance in some military settings. I had just completed the fort's provisions and reinforcement when a letter arrived from the governor requesting my attendance at an assembly meeting if circumstances allowed me to leave my post. My friends in the assembly also urged me to attend, citing the completion of our 3 intended forts and the settlers' contentment with their new protection. With the colonel from New England, Clapham, willing to take command due to his experience in Indian warfare, I handed him a commission, introduced him to the garrison, and gave them an exhortation before departing. Notably, they don't have mixed congregations like ours, instead gathering separately by gender and age group, married men and women followed by young men, young women, and children. Although I'd initially taken pride in the contribution of my writing, I chose not to dispute his opinion, considering this a generally amicable approach in such situations. As the new officers gathered, they elected me colonel of the regiment, which I accepted this time around. We had roughly 1,200 men parading with artillery that had become proficient at firing their 6 brass field pieces 12 times per minute. During my first inspection, the troops accompanied me to my home and saluted by firing a round before my door, causing glasses in my electrical laboratory to shatter. During my brief time as colonel, just before embarking on a trip to Virginia, the officers of my regiment unexpectedly decided it would be proper to escort me out of town all the way to the lower ferry. Despite the ongoing dispute between the governor and the House of Representatives, a disagreement in which I actively participated as a representative, I maintained a cordial relationship with the governor personally. Although I've forgotten my exact advice, I think it involved persuading General Dunbar to post his troops along the frontiers until reinforcements arrived from the colonies, allowing him to resume his expedition. After my return, the governor planned to have me lead a provincial force to capture Fort Duquesne, considering commissioning me as general. Perhaps he thought my popularity would facilitate troop recruitment, and that my influence in the assembly could secure funding without burdening the proprietary estate. As I didn't immediately agree to lead the expedition, The plan was abandoned and the governor later left office, replaced by Captain Denny. When news of Braddock's defeat reached us, I was quickly summoned by the governor to help devise strategies for retaining loyalty in the back colonies. Although I've forgotten my exact advice, I think it involved persuading General Dunbar to post his troops along the frontiers until reinforcements arrived from the colonies, allowing him to resume his expedition. After my return, the governor planned to have me lead a provincial force to capture Fort Duquesne, considering commissioning me as general. While he professed high regard for my military skills, I doubted myself and believe his praise was overstated. Perhaps he thought my popularity would facilitate troop recruitment. Chapter 18, Scientific Experiments. Before diving into my experiences under a new governor's leadership, let me provide an overview of how my reputation as a philosopher developed. In 1746, while in Boston, I encountered Dr. Spence, a recent arrival from Scotland who demonstrated some primitive electric experiment. Upon returning to Philadelphia, our library received a glass tube and its application from Mr. Collinson of the Royal Society of London. As a result, several individuals acquired these tubes and became proficient in performing various experiments. I assisted him by crafting 2 lectures that structured the experiments in a logical sequence with accompanying explanations. We were grateful to Mr. Collinson for his gift of the tube and other equipment, so I made sure to keep him informed about our progress in testing it through numerous letters detailing our experiments. Although the Royal Society read my reports, they initially didn't consider them noteworthy enough to publish in their transactions. One paper written on behalf of Mr. Kinnersley discussing the similarity between lightning and electricity was sent to Dr. Mitchell, a mutual acquaintance and member of the Royal Society. Mr. Collinson then provided them to Cave for publication in his Gentleman's Magazine. However, Cave decided to publish them separately in a pamphlet, with Dr. Fothergill writing the introduction. After being assured of Franklin's existence in Philadelphia, Nullet wrote and published a book of letters addressing Franklin and disputing his experiments and conclusions. I reasoned that my writings presented verifiable experiments and observations offered as hypotheses, not definitive statements, so there was no obligation to defend them. What propelled my book to widespread recognition was the successful outcome of an experiment conducted by Dalibard and Delors at Marly, drawing lightning from clouds. Delors, who had a setup for experimental philosophy and lectured on the subject, repeated his version of Philadelphia experiment before the king and royal court. I won't elaborate on that notable experiment or my own similar success with a kite in Philadelphia, as both are documented in historical accounts of electricity. Dr. Wright, an English physician, wrote to a friend at the Royal Society about the high regard his experiments were held in abroad, and their surprise that they hadn't received more attention in England. In response, the Society re-examined previous letters and compiled a summary by Dr. Watson praising the writer's work. Later, members like Mr. Canton verified his lightning rod experiment and shared the results with the Society. As a result, without him asking, he was elected a member and exempted from payment, receiving the Royal Society's transactions for free ever since. Dr. Wright, an English physician, wrote to a friend at the Royal Society about the high regard his experiments were held in abroad, and their surprise that they hadn't received more attention in England. In response, the Society re-examined previous letters and compiled a summary by Dr. Watson praising the writer's work. This was published in their transactions. Later, members like Mr. Canton verified his lightning rod experiment and shared the results with the Society. As a result, without him asking, he was elected a member and exempted from payment, receiving the Royal Society's transactions for free ever since. Additionally, they presented him with the 1753 gold medal of Sir Godfrey Copley, accompanied by a commendatory speech from Lord Macclesfield. Chapter 19, Agent of Pennsylvania in London. Our new governor, Captain Denny, presented me with a medal from the Royal Society during an evening event hosted by the city. He expressed his high regard for me, mentioning he had long known my character. After dinner, when the company was engaged in drinking, he privately approached me and revealed that friends in England advised him to foster a friendship with me due to my valuable counsel and potential support in making his governorship successful. He asked me to rely on his willingness to help whenever possible. The governor also discussed the province's proprietors' positive attitude towards the colony and how dropping opposition and restoring harmony between himself and the people would benefit everyone, especially me. It was believed that I could be most helpful in achieving this, with adequate recognition and rewards expected in return. As we didn't immediately rejoin the table, a decanter of Madeira wine was sent to us. The governor generously partook of it, becoming even more enthusiastic about his requests and promises as he did so. Our new governor, Captain Denny, presented me with a medal from the Royal Society during an evening event hosted by the city. The governor also discussed the province's proprietors' positive attitude towards the colony and how dropping opposition and restoring harmony between himself and the people would benefit everyone, especially me. My responses aimed to convey, "I'm fortunate enough to be self-sufficient, making proprietary favors unnecessary. As an assembly member, accepting such favors would be impossible. While having no personal animosity towards the proprietors, I'll enthusiastically support their proposals if they truly benefit the people." My previous opposition stemmed from measures favoring the proprietors at the people's expense. After a long struggle, the Assembly decided to take a stand against the proprietors' stubborn insistence on imposing inconsistent instructions on their representatives, which not only contradicted the people's rights, but also hindered the service of the Crown. Meanwhile, the House had passed a bill granting the King 60,000 with 15,000 allocated for Lord Loudoun, which the governor refused to approve, adhering strictly to his instructions from the proprietors. I had already arranged passage on a packet ship in New York when Lord Loudoun arrived in Philadelphia with the goal of resolving the disagreement between the governor and Assembly, ensuring their disputes wouldn't hinder the King's service. On behalf of the Assembly, I presented the various arguments from my published writings in public papers. The governor cited his instructions, the bond he'd made to follow them, and the ruin that would ensue if he disobeyed, yet seemed willing to take a risk if Lord Loudoun advised it. He asked me to persuade the Assembly, warning that if we didn't continue to defend our frontiers ourselves, we would leave them vulnerable to the enemy, and he wouldn't spare any of the King's troops for their defense. However, in the interim, the packet ship had already departed without my sea supplies, resulting in a loss for me. Before I arrived in New York, the person responsible for sending out packet boats had already stated that one of them would depart on the following Saturday. However, when I asked about the exact time to avoid delays, he revealed privately that if I was in New York by Monday morning, I would still make it, but not to linger beyond then. Despite a ferry delay that left me arriving at noon on Monday, I soon learned the packet boat had not departed and wouldn't until the next day due to favorable wind conditions. When I arrived in New York at the beginning of April, it was not until almost the end of June that we finally set sail. Initially, there were 2 packet boats waiting to depart, but they were delayed by the Lord's letters, which were almost ready. A 3rd packet boat eventually arrived, only to be delayed as well. Despite passengers growing impatient and merchants anxious about their letters and insurance orders due to wartime conditions for fall goods, no progress was made until Lordship completed his letters. Surprisingly, he always appeared at his desk with pen in hand, leading those who visited him to assume he must be writing extensively, despite the lack of progress on departing the packet boats. He had arrived with an urgent packet for the General from Governor Denny. Innes gave me letters from my friends in Philadelphia, prompting me to ask about his return and accommodation so that I could send more letters through him. He mentioned he was scheduled to return the next day at 9 a.m. to collect the General's response to the governor, and would then depart immediately. He explained that every morning for 2 weeks he had been summoned by order to collect a letter from the General's Lordship, but it still wasn't ready despite the General constantly working at his desk. Passengers expected to be at sea daily as 3 packet ships prepared to join a fleet at Sandy Hook. Our ship was part of this company but received permission to separate from the fleet 5 days into the journey. We then headed towards England, leaving the other 2 packet ships behind with the General and his troops at Halifax. The General changed his plans, deciding not to attack Louisburg after all, and instead returned to New York with his soldiers and the 2 packets, their passengers in tow. Afterwards, I met Captain Bonnell, who commanded a packet ship in London. He shared that when his vessel had been delayed by a month, he informed Lord General about the severe dirt buildup on his ship's hull, which would significantly impede its speed, a crucial aspect for a packet boat. Requesting 3 days to clean and maintain the ship, He was asked if it could be done in one day instead. When he replied that it couldn't, the general denied the request, emphasizing that the ship had to depart the next day at the latest. Despite being further delayed by several weeks, Captain Bonnell never received permission to perform the necessary repairs. In London, I encountered a passenger of Bonnell's who was deeply upset about being deceived and detained in New York before being taken to Halifax and back again by Lord Bonnell. In my opinion, if General Shirley had remained in command after Braddock's passing, he would have led a more effective campaign than Loudoun's in 1757, which was futile, costly, and embarrassing to our nation beyond measure. When the embargo was finally lifted, neglecting to notify Charleston led to the Carolina fleet being delayed for nearly 3 months, causing significant damage from shipworm that ultimately caused a substantial portion of them to sink on their return journey. At a celebration hosted by New York City for Lord Loudoun's appointment as commander, Shirley was present despite no longer holding that role. Once I presented these records to Lord Loudoun, he had a financial officer verify each item against its documentation, confirming everything was accurate. Just before leaving, he explained that he had reconsidered mixing his accounts with those of previous authorities and advised me to present my records directly at the Treasury upon returning to England, where I would be paid promptly. I pointed out the significant and unforeseen expense I incurred due to being detained in New York for so long as a reason for prompt payment. However, it didn't have an impact. Our captain had loudly praised his ship's speed before our departure, but unfortunately when we set sail it turned out to be one of the slowest among 96 vessels, much to his disappointment. After exploring various explanations for this sluggishness, we noticed that while approaching another similarly slow-moving ship, our own vessel gained speed and left its neighbor behind as we all congregated aft near the flagpole. It was then revealed that our captain had suspected. His ship's excess weight at the front was the culprit. The ship's captain claimed they had reached 13 knots, miles per hour previously, but Captain Kennedy from the Navy doubted this was possible, suggesting an error in measuring or logging their speed. After inspecting the logline and being satisfied with its accuracy, Captain Kennedy decided to measure the ship's speed himself. On a subsequent day with favorable winds, he conducted the experiment and ultimately admitted defeat, acknowledging that the ship indeed reached 13 knots. I'd like to emphasize this point. The uncertainty in assessing a ship's sailing performance before it sets sail is often cited as an imperfection in shipbuilding. Despite meticulously following the design of a good sailor, a new ship may unexpectedly turn out to be sluggish. Even on routine sailing trips, I've noticed varying decisions among officers in charge of different watches despite the same wind conditions. Nevertheless, I believe that conducting a series of experiments could establish optimal designs and settings for hull shape, mast dimensions, sail form and quantity, sail positioning based on wind direction, and cargo arrangement. We had a precise understanding of our location, and estimated we were close to Falmouth, so we planned to make good time at night to arrive at the harbor's mouth by morning, thereby evading notice from enemy privateers often patrolling the channel entrance. At midnight, our captain was asleep, but Captain Kennedy swiftly reacted by ordering the ship to make a sharp turn, despite the risk to the mast. Without delay, I traveled to London alongside my son, making brief stops along the route to admire Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain and the estate, including its impressive collection of antiquities belonging to Lord Pembroke at Wilton House. He advised against immediately complaining to the government and suggested speaking with the proprietaries first, as they might be persuaded by private friends to resolve matters amicably. Next, I met with Mr. Peter Collinson, an old friend, who informed me that John Hanbury wanted to meet me so he could take me to Lord Granville, the President of the Council, who was eager to speak with me. After discussing American affairs and the current state of our colonies, Lord Granville expressed his opinion on our Constitution. "You Americans have misconceptions about the nature of your Constitution." He explained that the King's instructions are not like casual guidelines for a minister abroad, but rather are carefully prepared by learned judges, debated in council, and signed by the King. I disagreed with this notion, pointing out that our charter state that our laws should be made by our assemblies and presented to the King for his royal assent, but once given he cannot repeal or alter them. Furthermore, I noted that the King's instructions could not be enforced without the Assembly's consent. Upon returning to my lodgings, I wrote down our discussion and reflected on a historical event. About 20 years prior, Parliament had proposed making the King's instructions laws in the colonies, but it was rejected by the Commons, earning their reputation as friends of liberty until their conduct in 1765 seemed to imply they reserved this power for themselves. The proprietaries subsequently sent our grievances to the Attorney and Solicitor General for an opinion, which remained unanswered for nearly a year despite my repeated requests. When the opinion finally arrived, the proprietaries did not share it with me, but instead sent a lengthy message through Paris, criticizing my informal submission as impolite, providing a weak justification of their conduct, and suggesting that if the Assembly would send someone to negotiate in a more cordial manner, they would be open to finding a resolution. During the pause, the Assembly successfully convinced Governor Denny to pass a law that equally taxed the proprietor's land and the people's property, the main contentious issue, but in doing so, they neglected to respond to the original request or message. The proprietaries, advised by Paris, decided to oppose the Act's passage, claiming it would harm their estate and leave them vulnerable to the people's wrath if left to determine taxes. The opposing side alleged that the Act aimed to burden the proprietors while sparing the common people, and that if allowed to stand, the proprietaries, already unpopular with the public, would be ruined by arbitrary taxation. The key point we made was that repealing the Act would result in financial chaos, as some 100,000 already printed for the King's use would be taken back from the people, causing financial ruin and discouraging future grants. Lord Mansfield took me aside during the debate, and asked if I truly believed no harm would come to the proprietary estate under the Act's execution. This was accepted by both parties, and Lord Mansfield returned to the council chamber where the law ultimately passed with some minor changes recommended for subsequent legislation. The Assembly set up a committee to investigate the assessor's proceedings, comprising several proprietaries' friends. In contrast, the proprietaries were furious with Governor Denny for passing the Act and threatened to sue him for violating his instructions, which he had sworn to uphold. Despite these threats, Governor Denny disregarded them due to having acted at the general's behest and in service to the king, and also owing to influential connections at court. The Assembly appreciated my contribution to the province by securing the credibility of paper money throughout the region when I initiated the engagement's first part. Upon my return, they formally expressed their gratitude. In contrast, the proprietaries were furious with Governor Denny for passing the Act and threatened to sue him for violating his instructions, which he had sworn to uphold. Despite these threats, Governor Denny disregarded them due to having acted at the general's behest and in service to the king, and also owing to influential connections at court. The proprietaries' threats ultimately went unfulfilled. It continues as original. Introduction. Americans enthusiastically consume writings claiming to reveal a formula for achieving success, only to be frequently let down by trite statements or well-known advice that goes unheeded. The life stories of renowned individuals often fail to inspire because they lack a relatable human touch, making the narrative feel distant and inaccessible. Meanwhile, we search high and low for a magic solution to guaranteed prosperity, overlooking the empowering potential readily available if only we extend our hand to grasp it. Much like the enchanting power in Milton's comus that lies within our reach if we seize it, the life story of Benjamin Franklin, though often overlooked, has been lived by many in daily routine. Even the ordinary person wears out their shoes on its streets. But Franklin's autobiography offers more than just an account of his existence. It's the captivating narrative of a remarkable individual whose thoughts and actions provide companionship for those facing challenges, much like the guidance from a wise and supportive friend. Franklin's autobiography stands out among other great leaders' life stories due to its down-to-earth humanity. Written for his descendants, Franklin aimed to inspire their success by sharing his rags-to-riches journey. The young reader is captivated by finding that even a legendary figure like Franklin faced everyday struggles and passions similar to their own, fostering a sense of hope and motivation rather than discouragement. Benjamin Franklin's life is crucial to American history because he played a significant role in securing America's independence and establishing it as a nation. Alongside George Washington, Franklin shares top honors for his contributions during the Revolutionary era and the birth of the new nation. While Washington led the colonial struggle, Franklin effectively advocated abroad, leveraging his persuasive reasoning, witty satire, and diplomatic skills to present the American case in England and France. Franklin's admirable qualities, including patience, resilience, practical wisdom, and selfless dedication, are comparable to those of Washington, with both men demonstrating complete disinterest in personal gain during their public service. Franklin's life and principles have significantly contributed to the financial success of Americans. Franklin embodies the best qualities of American manhood, despite not being among the wealthiest or most powerful individuals. Franklin's autobiography tells an inspiring story of his journey from a humble childhood in a tallow chandler shop to achieving greatness through hard work, thrift, and continuous self-improvement. This narrative serves as a remarkable example of the incredible outcomes possible in America, where equal opportunities abound when individuals follow Franklin's principles. Benjamin Franklin's renown extended beyond his home country. Despite living during an era characterized by swift advancements in science and politics, even a perceptive critic like Lord Jeffrey, editor of the Edinburgh Review, believed that in one respect Franklin's name surpassed those of other 18th-century luminaries. As both a statesman and a philosopher, Franklin demonstrated an extraordinary fusion of talents, with few individuals achieving such high levels of distinction in either field alone, let alone both. Benjamin Franklin was a multi-talented individual who left an impressive mark on various fields. Nicknamed the father of all Yankees by Carlyle, Franklin founded a fire company, improved public services like street cleaning and lighting, developed journalism, established institutions like the American Philosophical Society, Philadelphia's Public Library, and the University of Pennsylvania, and organized the colony's postal system, which became the basis for the U.S. postal system, which became the basis for the U.S. Post Office. Franklin was also an accomplished writer, penning the renowned Autobiography and Poor Richard's Almanac. Studying Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is valuable not only for its content, but also because of its writing style. If Robert Louis Stevenson was correct that he developed his remarkable writing style through imitation, then one seeking to express their ideas effectively should study Franklin's approach. Benjamin Franklin's literary significance is challenging to assess since he wasn't a professional writer by trade. In terms of American literature, Benjamin Franklin stands alone in his time. Franklin was the first U.S. author to achieve lasting fame in Europe. His works like the Autobiography, Poor Richard, Father Abraham's Speech of the Way to Wealth, and Some Bagatelles, are as well known abroad as any American writings. Benjamin Franklin's writing style is straightforward and energetic, more akin to early writers. The origin story of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is an engaging tale in itself. Initially composed as a letter to his son, William Franklin, the first part was not intended for publication, resulting in an informal tone and more personal narrative style compared to the second part, covering 1730 onwards, which was penned with publication in mind. The manuscript shows minimal signs of revision, featuring a down-to-earth and natural writing style that even led his grandson William Temple Franklin to modify certain phrases during editing, considering them unrefined and coarse. Franklin started writing his life story during a visit to Bishop Shipley's home in Twyford, Hampshire, England in 1771. Years later, an old friend, Abel James, stumbled upon 23 pages of Franklin's handwritten story and sent a copy to him at Passy, near Paris, encouraging him to finish writing. Franklin resumed work on his autobiography in 1784, initially with the goal of educating young readers. Despite being old, frail, and busy with public duties, Franklin continued working on his story until it reached the year 1757. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin's original autobiography manuscript embarked on a journey of its own. Upon his death, Franklin entrusted it to his grandson, William Temple Franklin, naming him as the literary executor for his works. When Temple Franklin prepared his grandfather's writings for publication in 1817, he traded the original manuscript with Avalard's daughter for a clearer copy, likely believing it would make better printing material. When Mr. Bigelow reviewed his acquisition, he was surprised to discover that what people had long considered the genuine autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, supposedly written by himself, was actually a flawed and incomplete version. In response, Mr. Bigelow published the standard edition of Franklin's autobiography in 1868, correcting errors from previous editions and including the previously omitted final section, written by Franklin in his last year. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography has been widely reprinted in the United States and translated into European languages due to its enduring popularity. Despite being in high demand at circulating libraries, the book's fame is understandable, as it recounts Franklin's remarkable life with a unique blend of common sense and practical wisdom on living. The autobiography's success can also be attributed to Franklin's concise and vivid writing style, which employs short sentences, simple language, relatable examples, and clever references. As one of the era's most skilled conversationalists, Franklin's life was certainly fascinating, diverse, and unconventional. Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. In early autumn of 1916, the Gilman Country School in Baltimore was in session.